We're now in public session. Okay, good morning everybody, and you're very welcome to the Joint Committee on Housing, Joint Oireachtas Committee on Housing, Local Government and Heritage. This morning we resume our pre-legislative scrutiny of the General Scheme of the Marine Protected Areas Bill 2022, and we're joined this morning. A laptop on there somewhere. We are joined this morning from Wind Energy Ireland. We're joined by Mr. Niall Goodwin, Head of Policy, Mr. Dennis Devan, Senior Policy Analyst, and Ms. Patricia Cumisky, Member of the Offshore Consenting Committee. You're welcome. And from the Irish Environmental Network, we are joined by Ms. Oireachtas Ibrahim, Environmental Law Officer, Dr. Donald Griffin from Fair Seas Ireland, Mr. Padraig Fogarty of the Irish Wildlife Trust, Ms. Sinead Loughran of Birdwatch Ireland, and online we're joined by Mr. Patrick Lynn of the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. And members have been circulated with your opening statements and submissions in advance. So just a quick note on privilege before we start. I wish to remind members of the constitutional requirement that members must be physically present within the confines of the place where the Parliament has chosen to sit, namely Leinster House, in order to participate in public meetings. For those attending in the committee room, you're protected by absolute privilege in respect of your contributions to today's meeting. This means that you have an absolute defence against any defamation action for anything you say at the meeting. Witnesses attending remotely do not have the same privilege. Both members and witnesses are expected not to abuse the privilege they enjoy, and it's my duty as Chair to ensure that this privilege is not abused. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you'll be directed to discontinue your remarks. It's imperative that you comply with any such direction. Members and witnesses are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So you're very welcome this morning. The format that we follow here is we have the opening statements from I think we have an opening statement just from Wind Energy Ireland and an opening statement from the Irish Environmental Network. Is it on behalf of the groups represented? Then we go into members' questions, and we do that in 7-minute slots. So it's 7 minutes to ask the question and also to receive the answer as well. So it's important that members leave time for witnesses to answer. This is our third meeting on the Marine Protected Areas Bill, our third pre-legislative scrutiny meeting. We met with the department last week. We met with Professor Tasman Crowe on Tuesday, and we're delighted to be joined by experts from the Environmental Network and from Wind Energy Ireland. So I'm going to invite Wind Energy Ireland, Mr. Devane, please, if you wish to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chair. It'll actually be myself who will make the statement.
Mr. Goodwin, please.
Thank you very much. And so on behalf of Wind Energy Ireland, I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to join you today. As mentioned by the Chair, I'm joined by my colleagues Dennis Devan, Senior Policy Analyst, and Patricia Cumisky, Consenting and Government Relations Manager at Simply Blue Group and member of our Offshore Consenting Committee. I'd like to begin by strongly welcoming the publication of this general scheme as a significant step towards achieving what I believe is a shared commitment among all of us to reach our target of protecting 30% of Ireland's maritime area by 2030. We live not only in a climate emergency, to which offshore wind farms are part of the solution, but also in a global biodiversity crisis where marine protected areas have a critical role to play. We'd like to begin by emphasising our commitment to the idea of co-location of offshore wind farms with marine protected areas. We believe that offshore wind projects can be suitably located with MPAs, particularly where there's a requirement to rejuvenate areas of seabed or reef. There are real tangible examples in the North Sea where offshore wind installations have resulted in ecosystem benefits within the footprint of the project. For example, there has been ongoing monitoring at a Belgian offshore wind farm since 2005, which shows growth in reefs post-wind farm construction. MARI has also recently published a review on the ecosystem benefits of offshore wind projects, which we would recommend to this committee, along with a recent presentation given at WEI's offshore conference on nature enhancement and offshore wind, which is referenced in the statement circulated. However, we also acknowledge that there will be MPAs designated where offshore wind energy development will be completely unsuitable. It is our belief that offshore wind farms and marine protected areas can not only coexist, but together can be vital to ensuring the maintenance of Ireland's marine biodiversity. We would now like to make some comments on the general scheme for the Marine Protected Areas Bill in the hope that it will improve the final legislation. And taking Head 3 first, application. We would like to raise a query regarding some of the definitions and applications set out under this head. Section 3(1)(c) suggests that the Act will apply to the airspace above the areas identified in Section 1A and 1B. In the explanatory note, it states that this definition is drawn from the Maritime Area Planning Act. However, as committee members will know, the Maritime Area Planning Act makes no reference to airspace. Members will also recall late last year that a proposal from the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage to amend the definition of foreshore in law by extending it to the airspace was withdrawn. We would ask committee members to consider raising this issue with the Department in its report to seek clarification as to the reason airspace will be included in definitions for marine protected areas, but is not included in the Maritime Area Planning Act, nor in the definition of foreshore as recently amended. Taking Head 6, Ocean Environment Policy Statement. So Head 6.6 states that the period for public consultation on the draft Ocean Environment Policy Statement should be 4 weeks. We would strongly support comments made previously by Senator Victor Boyhan that this period is insufficient. I know we, for example, would struggle to respond comprehensively in that time frame, and it would be even more challenging for members of the public or organisations with limited resources. Considering that once the statement is finalised, it will not be reviewed again for 6 years, it makes sense to make this consultation as accessible as possible. We would ask the committee to consider extending the consultation period to at least 8 weeks. In addition, under Section 6.3, we propose the inclusion of the EU Renewable Energy Directive, so that's Directive EU 2018-2001, and the European Climate Law, so Regulation EU 2001-1119. They are key drivers of national emission reductions, and the policy statements should consider them closely. They enshrine in legislation the obligation to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. Finally, the Habitats Directive and Birds Directive should also be added to the list, given in the bill it states it shall not consider proposals relating to the protection and conservation of species or habitats protected under the Natura 2000 network unless proposals provide additional protection. Taking Head 7, identification of potential marine protected areas. So under Head 7, there are a number of terms that are either not, to our knowledge, defined in legislation and about which there might be different interpretations. Section 5 refers, for example, to ecosystem services and an ecosystem-based approach. It also requires the Minister to consider sustainable development. I'd like to be clear that we're not objecting to the inclusion of these terms, but we would suggest that it is important that they be clearly and specifically defined in legislation so that there is a common understanding as to what is being proposed. Regarding Head 10, consultation, there is no reference in Head 10 to the need for consultation with the holders of maritime area consents. As members will know, the first of these consents were awarded shortly before Christmas, and it is likely that the second set, for what will come to be known as the Phase 2 projects, will be granted before the end of the year. It would seem appropriate to us, especially in a context where the holders of fossil fuel licences are to be consulted, that the same opportunity would be afforded to holders of maritime area consents, and we would ask that the committee to consider recommending this in its final report. Section 7 under this head sets out the Minister's power to accept, reject or amend any proposal to designate parts of our marine species as an MPA. We believe that it would be helpful in the interests of transparency for the Minister to be required to set out in writing the grounds for any such decision and for this to be made public and laid before the Oireachtas. Head 16, composition and appointment of the scientific and technical and socio-economic body. We welcome the proposal for an expert body to be established to support the Minister and the designation of marine protected areas. We would suggest, though, that as well as possessing the expertise set out under this head, the Minister would be required to ensure that the expert body include representation from environmental NGOs, the fishing and aquaculture community and the offshore renewable energy industry. We would also suggest that the committee should consider, as well as providing for a secretariat, that funding should be set aside to support representatives on that expert body to fully participate in the process. We are very conscious from our engagement with environmental organisations and with seafood industry representatives that their capacity to contribute to the extent that they would like in many areas of marine planning is restricted by their resources, and consideration should be given to assisting them. In closing, I'd like to briefly expand on that point regarding resources. A designation of an MPA should be based on robust evidence and data. This means funding must be allocated to support baseline data acquisition and ongoing monitoring mechanisms. These programmes must be flexible enough to allow for the management of MPAs to adapt as new evidence comes to light, where, for example, boundaries may need to shift to account for particularly mobile species. There should also be consideration given to the level of support required for enforcement. In addition, significant consideration will be required for systems to store and manage data gathered in the marine environment. Finally, we believe that engagement with environmental NGOs is crucial to ensure robust planning and development of this resource, and would advocate increases in government support to underpin marine environmental NGO activities in Ireland. I'd reiterate the point that we made at the start, that we believe the coexistence between offshore renewable energy and marine protected areas is important, and also just to reiterate that other point, that there is a need for some clarity among the definitions and legal certainty in the heads of bill. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. Now I'm going to invite Ms. Dubrin. Are you going to make the opening statement on behalf of IEN, please?
Thank you, Chair. Okay, here, look, members of the committee. I'm joined here this morning by my colleagues, Donald Griffin, Marine Policy Officer for Fair Seas Ireland, Padraig Fogarty, Campaigns Officer for the Irish Wildlife Trust, Patrick Lynn, Online, Officer of the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, and also Sinead Loughran, Marine Policy and Advocacy Officer of Birdwatch Ireland. We wish to express our sincere appreciation for the invitation to engage with you in this hearing for the pre-legislative scrutiny of this very important general scheme for the Marine Protected Areas Bill 2022. We see this invitation as a very welcome acknowledgement that the Irish Environmental Network, IEN, the coalition of national NGOs in Ireland, represents a key constituency of stakeholders with interest, experience and expertise on these matters. We welcome the publishing of this long-awaited general scheme. Ireland is already 9 years late delivering on the obligation to provide for MPAs under the EU's Marine Strategy Framework Directive, MSFD. In our view, this delay further compromises Ireland's implementation of the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, including Ireland's Maritime Spatial Plan, the National Marine Planning Framework, and the certainty which developments and activities need to advance under the Maritime Area Planning Act and other legislation, knowing where they can and can't hope to operate. The importance of new national legislation allowing for the identification, designation and management of new protected areas cannot therefore be overstated. In addition to the above, some further benefits and relevant considerations are outlined here. We will be happy to elaborate on them today if it is useful for the committee, and further information is included in our detailed submissions. Marine protected areas are an essential conservation tool employed by countries across the world to deliver a healthy planet through healthy seas, reversing biodiversity loss and decline, and amongst other things, by helping to mitigate the impacts of climate change and in the maintenance of the atmosphere essential to all life on Earth. As this committee will well understand, Ireland is amongst one of the EU's largest countries when our marine territory is also considered. Therefore, we have a huge moral responsibility for the stewardship of this area, not just in the context of the European Union, but in a planetary context. And I would have to say I welcomed the remarks of the Department in that regard in its opening statement. Successful and effective marine protected areas can be a driver of good biodiversity, climate, community, social, economic and health outcomes. Therefore, creating new marine protected areas in Irish waters which effectively protect and restore Ireland's seas is not only an investment in nature, but also in sustainable economies and societies in Ireland and a healthy future, particularly for all the communities in constituencies all around our coast. However, Ireland has failed to meet good environmental status, the fundamental objective of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, from which the requirement for MPAs derive, for biodiversity, commercial fish and shellfish and seafloor integrity, with the environmental status of food webs in Ireland's marine environment is unknown, and we can expand further on this and other areas of concern. However, these categorisations hide the shocking actual figures behind them. Moreover, the National Biodiversity Data Centre has highlighted 1 million species worldwide are now in danger of extinction. In Ireland, we have 31,000 species recorded to date, of which only 10% have had their conservation status assessed. Yet there is still a fundamental lack of knowledge of what needs protecting and how to protect it. We also need to act to protect that which is unknown and to rigorously apply the precautionary principle and to increase our investment in independent scientific research so we can safely and appropriately both use and conserve and restore our marine environment. Turning then to the general scheme, the basic framework includes a number of positive ingredients essential for delivery and implementation of marine protected areas. For example, the concept of targets, highlighting of key legislative tools such as strategic environmental assessment, provisions on public participation, involvement of expertise, and objectives for individual MPAs, together with considerations related to monitoring and enforcement. These are welcome in principle. However, we wish to be very clear that even in respect of these basics, there is a grave concern on the overall lack of robustness, ambition, and detail undermining their ultimate contribution within the legislation. Additionally, there are serious gaps and weaknesses in other fundamental ingredients necessary for effective MPA designation and implementation. These issues are, for example, but not limited to, weaknesses in respect of designation targets, timelines and time limits within the scheme for key actions and decisions, requirements on data, collation and information, inadequacy on the species and habitats and other protections considered, considerations and processes informing designations, nature of MPA designations, types and hierarchies and provision of an ecologically coherent and representative network, management, monitoring, enforcement, resourcing. These, together with matters which seriously limit or puncture the protections to be afforded by an MPA, are compounded by weak and ambiguous language overall and an extraordinary level of ministerial discretion throughout. Evaluated as a basic piece of legislation in terms of what it can deliver as an outcome, it falls very short, leaving scope for delay, weak implementation and poor, inadequate protection. It falls far short of the expectation of our members focused on this area. In particular, of the most serious concern are the failure to permeate and link the general scheme with the wider legislative architecture necessary to clearly inform the legal purpose of this MPA legislation, and which should inform key actions and decisions by various actors throughout the legislation. Serious transposition issues also, and a failure to address issues with other legislation, for example, aquaculture. This is compounded by two further failures. A failure to provide clearly for access to justice provisions, the ability to hold to account before our courts, in respect of public authorities and private bodies and individuals. B, the failure to adequately address the issue when a delayed MPA designations intersect with authorisations already granted. We would be happy to expand on our concerns in respect of these and other areas of interest to the committee and our recommendations accordingly. We welcome your questions and will do our best to answer them and are to revert with any further detail or clarifications required. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Ibrahim. Okay, I'll move on to the members' questions and answers, and we can explore some of those concerns and highlighted by both submissions. So I'll go first to Senator Fitzpatrick. You can take the first slot, please.
Yeah, Gurmageth, Kirloch, and thank you all for your attendance and your submissions. This is obviously a hugely important piece of legislation, long overdue, and so we want to get our work done as expeditiously as possible and move on, like yourselves, to having some robust and comprehensive legislation to protect our marine areas. Ireland's marine area is obviously one of the largest, and it's not just, I suppose, about protecting, it's, as you say, restoring, protecting and ensuring that it's properly managed, sustainably managed into the future. For, I suppose, biodiversity issues, climate action, but also our energy security. So we all get it. You very clearly welcome the legislation, and we also sense the urgency that you want us to take. So my questions are, I'm going to start with, just can I clarify one kind of basic housekeeping thing? For the Irish Environmental Network, your engagement with the department, is it just in this forum or outside of this forum? Because there's a very constructive criticism, I think, here within your statement, but have you engaged outside of this forum directly with the department, and how does that work for you? Have you made submissions to them
I'll take a preliminary shot at an answer and stand to be corrected by my colleagues because I'm coming in a little bit late to this particular piece of legislation in the context of the engagement of others on this. To the best of my knowledge, there has been no formal public consultation on these heads or wider engagement. Obviously, there's been a number of stakeholder forums associated with different types of activities associated with the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive legislation, but specifically under the auspices of the MPAs, which derive from the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. This MPA, there's been consultations, as you will have heard from Professor Tasman Crowe, in respect of, expanding the network, etc. But in relation to the heads of bill that you see before, not that I'm aware of, but I stand to be corrected on that.
Just to say that we have submitted Fair Seas. I work for Fair Seas, the campaign, which in the marine protected areas are a huge focus of that campaign. So we have engaged the department in submitting a paper we had produced earlier this year, or asked for the legislation, and we haven't engaged them since the publishing of the general scheme.
That's great, thank you. Can I then just ask, wind energy, you make some specific asks, let's say so, and I know time is going to be constrained, but I'll start with your first one here. Your ask about the airspace, can you just elaborate? Like, I understand what your ask is, but can you explain the practical implications of your ask, what the benefit, as you see it, would be? And then I'd really like a response from the environmental network on that proposal as well, and how you see it. Is that okay? If time allows, Chair.
Thanks for the question, Senator Fitzpatrick. And I can start off, and I might ask my colleague Patricia Comiskey to expand on some of the detail as well from a developer perspective. But really what the ask here is basically just for kind of legal certainty on where this applies. So we'll remember back to before Christmas when we had the proposed change to the foreshore area to extend to the airspace. That was ultimately withdrawn because there were various problems with it. In this case, we just want to make sure that we're very clear on what can be done and where, and that just requires it to be kind of fully defined and very clearly defined. So there's, I guess, legal certainty for a project. So if you're a developer looking to carry out surveys, or if you're looking to do the preparatory work that's needed to make sure that your project has, the absolute minimal environmental impact possible, you want to be able to know exactly the area that you're allowed to operate in and what you can do there. I might pass to Patricia Comiskey just to explain that sort of the risk that a project needs to be certain of.
Thanks, Niall, and thanks, Senator Fitzgerald. Yeah, or Fitzpatrick, excuse me.
It's okay.
So I suppose for us, the main concern is around the parameters that might be set for that. And it's understanding those parameters. As Niall said, at the moment, many of the projects that are looking to develop are carrying out what's known as aerial surveys. So we're flying out to the sites and taking data of the activity on the site for birds and marine mammals. And I suppose because it's left quite open, there's not clarity on whether, like, surveys which are relatively benign and not having an impact on, say, a potential marine protected area or a foreshore space, how they would be dealt with. So I think it's really that we're looking for clarity around the parameters of that airspace piece and what is actually meant by that.
Okay.
I will call on colleagues to support me in this answer, Senator, and I think it's a really interesting discussion, particularly in the context of the controversy around the changes that were enacted there just before Christmas in the Planning and Development and Foreshore Amendment Act. We also have concerns in respect of the airspace definition and the application in Head 3, for example. In Head 3.1c, it says the airspace above the area of application set out in subsections in sections in respect of birds, bats and any other flying animal using that space. Well, as my colleague Patrick Lynn will advocate very clearly, whales use the airspace. It is an essential resting place, effectively, for whales when they come to the surface of the sea to breathe. It is a fundamental part of, their ability to survive. So that definition is inadequate or that application is inadequate from our point of view, and the need to protect the airspace is particularly important. There was some very interesting considerations in Professor, if I can short circuit, as I say, calling Professor Crow's report on the expanding the marine networks around not just marine protected areas for habitats and species, but also to respect certain characteristics of the marine. For example, like quiet spaces, dark spaces, because noise can have really profound effects on biodiversity. Like seismic surveying can kill krill, which is the foundation stone for the whole food chain within the seas. So protecting areas from noise, be that overflight, be it within the waters, the water column, that can be particularly important. So it's a case of what needs to be protected and appropriately incorporating, and I think there should be flexibility to allow for that. But I certainly wouldn't be for ruling it out entirely, absolutely not. It's Patrick online, I think, in particular, might want to come in there.
I suppose I don't, to be honest, I mean, unless aircraft are flying very low, it's not really going to be a problem for whales and dolphins. I would have thought it'd be more of an issue for birds, to be honest, and to have some sort of sensible controls on aerial surveys that are flying low. But for me, I don't see the airspace as being the biggest issue in this bill.
Thank you, Senator Fitzpatrick. And I'm going to move now to Deputy O'Brien, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks everybody for their presentations. There's kind of 7 areas of the general scheme I'm interested to get both the IEN and Wind Energy Ireland's responses to. You're not going to get to respond to all 7 in the 7 minutes I have, so if maybe you'd take a note of them and maybe correspond with the committee on them, because I think they'll be of interest to all members. So I just rattled through the 7 and then maybe Oireachtas, and then Niall, if you could respond as possible. Head 6.4, the 10% as soon as practicable, and up to the 30%. That language seems very weak to me and certainly not consistent with our current EU obligations and potentially future EU legal requirements. So I'm just interested in your views on the language there. Head 7.4, this is the kind of the response time for organisations in relation to the designations. It's 6 weeks. Again, that seems to me similar to the point about 4 weeks that I made, simply too short, and I'd be interested in your views on that. Head 13, obviously the section on emergency measures for climate adaptation. Obviously, it's welcome that there's an element of climate there, but I'm just, again, interested to hear people's very specific views as to, is it strong enough or is it too restrictive? Head 14.5 for me is one of the most concerning bits of the general scheme, and that's in respect to somebody who has an existing authorisation or licence, and where that activity may actually not comply with the conservation requirements in the public interest, the activity would be allowed to continue. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be provision like this. For me, the big question is who decides that and against what criteria, and I'd be interested to hear both organisations' views on this. And then, I suppose, 3 general areas. The enforcement section is exceptionally unclear, and particularly the overlay between the Navy and the Marine Institute and other organisations. Related to that, the actual architecture, we asked the department to kind of map out all the different organisations and agencies in the first session in terms of enforcing this. And I think I was dizzy at the end of the description. So I'm interested in people's views of the enforcement provisions, but also how that might actually work in real time in terms of the complexity of the architecture. And then again, just on timelines, there are no timelines. And again, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more from both organisations in terms of what the timelines could or should be from your different perspectives. Thanks, Chair.
And just to add to that, we've been consistently addressing these subjects in the 2 previous meetings. So if you don't get time to address each one of those points, we will address them in the second round. So we can do them in a little bit more detail. You don't need to rush through them. Thank you. And you were directing that question to...
So to Oireachtas first, and then to Niall, if possible.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for your question, Deputy. In respect of Head 6.4 and the targets, I certainly will turn to colleagues to expand on this, but yes, we will absolutely concur and very much welcome the sessions that have highlighted to date the weakness of the language there, particularly up to 30% aim to designate. They're all very weak in the context of particular targets that my colleagues will expand upon. But I would just add in it's not so much a case of field the width or, field the quality. It's an issue of what you are actually designating. 10% of the areas that don't need to be designated is very little value. 45% of the areas that don't need to be designated is of very little value. And the fundamental objective of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is good environmental status. That's what we need to be aiming to be delivering on to facilitate achievement of that objective and to actually deliver on the fundamental requirement for an ecologically coherent network which is representative, to be echoing not just a target, a number, but the nature of the network. And that's what's significantly missing in a target-based approach and in the absence of the legal architecture of the directives underpinning these requirements. I'll just touch on the consultation periods. I think there's been a recognition that there's concerns. Could you just refresh me, Deputy, in relation to which head in particular the consultation was a concern on?
Yeah, sure. So there's a 6-week requirement in Head 7, subsection 4, and that's response times to the proposed ministerial designations.
Yes, I think that is definitely an issue, because you could actually have multiple proposals coming out at the same time, and the ability to actually not just look at them but consider the cumulative impacts. If you consider that even to make an access to information on the environment request will take 4 weeks generally to get a response, those timelines are very inadequate. I would say timelines generally in relation to the public participation are a concern throughout, particularly in relation to the OECP, and perhaps we'll get a chance to revisit that, particularly because I think there's a lot of very pertinent points to be made around the consultations on that. In respect to 14.5, I think the issues there are very, very complex legally, because an MPA can incorporate not just an MPA designation, but sub-designations, for example, of an SPA, a proposed SPA, because we have outstanding designations, a candidate special area of conservation and a special area of conservation, and indeed other protections. And how that ROPI provision applies legally, we could have a conference on in terms of just discussing the jurisprudence. So I think there's an awful lot of teasing out to be done, particularly depending on when these provisions come forward and the status of outstanding designations in the marine environment. I think your point in relation to who gets consulted on this is absolutely key, and the bodies involved in that. And certainly that particular head would give extreme concern in relation to the vagueness of the consultation and the decision making around that. And I would say very much related to that is Head 14.2, which I hope we'll have a chance to revisit in respect of the intersection of existing authorisations as well. But just on timelines, generally there is a vagueness. There's quite prescriptive timelines in respect of participation. I think there's 1 or 2 timelines in respect of that the Minister has to bring forward the OECP within that's the Ocean Environment Policy Statement within a year of enactment. But apart from that, once something goes back to the Minister or where he is required to set up expert bodies, huge amount of discretion, compounded by 113 references of or use of the word may throughout the document. But if you think about...
How many did you say?
113. Some legitimate, but some very concerning. So the timeline issue, I suppose, if you could compare it to what this committee will be looking at over the next number of weeks in the Planning and Development Act, the pressure that there is for timelines for delivering for development, understandably so in the context of our housing crisis, our energy crisis, etc. But for decision makers to come back with decisions and to be penalised financially if they don't. Like, that's the proposals that we're seeing coming forward from the same department. But when it comes to delivering on obligations which are already 9 years late, we have virtually no timelines, within the bill to sort of say the Minister must do X. But I would certainly ask other colleagues to comment on the targets.
Yeah, if I can, Deputy Mayor, comment on just on Head 6.4. The programme for government obviously has a target to meet 30% by 2030. The recently agreed Kunming, Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed at COP15, said we should get to at least 30%. So the targets are pretty modest, actually. The scientific consensus is moving towards protecting 50% of the sea, and obviously the right 50%. But it would worry me that we're not actually committing to meet 30% under that head. The other thing is the requirement for strict protection, which is within the EU biodiversity strategy. Again, strict protection, the target there is 10%, which is extremely modest. Given the pressure the sea is under. So, I mean, I would feel strongly that we have to have a target for strict protection in there as well within that overall MPA target.
Mr. Lynn, you have your hand up there, and apologies, I didn't notice the hand. You're at a bit of a disadvantage being online, so
yeah, that's fine. I just want
to
reiterate Padraig's point that he just made, that the bill completely omits the 10% strict protection. It's not in there anywhere in the document, and it is an EU requirement that 10% should be strictly protected. That would include things like no take zones, no fishing, which needs to be negotiated, obviously. But that is a very important part, because that is probably what will protect biodiversity more than lines on a map.
Thanks, Mr. Lynn. I'm going to move on, Deputy Brin, but we'll come back and cover those. And I'm going to go next to Deputy Higgins. You're going to take the next slot, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to all of our witnesses and guests for being here with us today. I suppose we're an island nation, so we all know the importance of seas to Ireland in terms of not just access to our shores, but the preservation of nature and of biodiversity. And as Oireachtas so articulately put it, that importance to achieving a sustainable economy and sustainable future for our people. We know that to achieve that, we need to get from 8% to 30% in terms of protected areas. We know that, the EU knows that, Minister Malcolm Noonan, who's here with us today, knows that, and I believe is 100% committed to that. I suppose I come from the corporate world, so I'm all about targets and I'm all about mapping out how to achieve them and by what deadline. Padraig, your language was at least 30%, at least 10%, and the legislation, as we've discussed, provides for up to 30% and up to 10%, which, as Padraig has said, is an EU requirement. Oireachtas, in your statement, you spoke about the bill having scope for delays and your views of it being weak when it comes to implementation. And I suppose just looking at what Fair Seas had provided us with in advance of today's meeting, in your submission, you had suggested that the text needs to be stronger and state the Minister shall and remove to the extent possible and appropriate aim to. So the Minister shall designate, instead of up to, designate 10% of the maritime area as maritime protected area as soon as practicable after commencement of this Act, and remove up to, and 30% of the maritime area as marine protected areas by 2030. So I suppose what you're suggesting is we take out some of that, I suppose, wiggle room, if you could call it that, where we say to the extent possible and appropriate, and we take out up to and make the targets rounded, fresh, 10% and 30%. I suppose my question then to Oireachtas, who dealt with that in her submission, is would that be much stronger in your opinion? Would that satisfy the requirements?
I think it would certainly go a long way, but I would just hark back to why do we need MPAs in the first place? What is the fundamental legal obligation? They're the objective that, and if this goes to the Court of Justice, it will look at the adequacy of what Ireland has done and the extent to which it is or isn't actually credibly contributing to good environmental status, which is the fundamental objective. If there is an issue of interpretation, that's the purpose of approach that the court will take. So we need to underpin our targets with a rationale throughout the bill in terms of its decision making, its architecture, and those targets which meaningfully contributes to that, and which is actually delivering a target which is an ecologically coherent representative network of MPAs. As I said, it's not just 45% of that over there, because it doesn't get in the way of what we want to do here.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And Niall, I suppose you made the point in your opening statements about 4 weeks being too tight when it comes to the consultation period, and a lot of our witnesses who've been before us on this have made that same point. I suppose just to agree with you on the 8 weeks, I think that seems reasonable. I think it's 10 weeks when it comes to development plans, which are also reviewed every 6 years. So there's probably a bit of precedence there, and there's certainly not 4 weeks. You also raise the need for grounds for decisions to be laid out in writing and laid before the House of the Oireachtas. I suppose I'm keen to know what the benefit of laying before the House of the Oireachtas will be, but I'm actually more interested to learn about the need for the grounds to be laid out in writing. Are you saying that the bill does not currently provide for that, or that it doesn't provide for the written determination to be published? I suppose just keen to understand that and probably just compare it to how we deal with our current planning system in terms of onshore. I hear what everyone's saying in terms of airspace, and I think that is something that the department should look at, but now maybe if you deal with that particular one.
Yeah, thanks for the questions, Deputy. And look, yeah, we both agree on the period for consultation being too tight. I think colleagues here mentioned already that public participation is really, really important in all of this, and we need to make sure that people have the opportunity to feed into this process and you know, have their voices heard in terms of how we do this. So like 8 weeks, 10 weeks, we say 8 weeks would be good. It needs to be more than 4 weeks. I think there's general agreement on that, which is good to see. In terms of the grounds for decisions being in writing first and foremost and being laid before the Oireachtas, I guess what we're looking for here is just full transparency on it all. We need to be very clear on why decisions are being made. You know, from a developer perspective, if you're developing an offshore wind farm, you need to be very clear on why this designation is being done. Equally so, someone from you know, members of the public, affected communities, you know, members of environmental NGOs will want to be very clear on why this decision has been taken. I think that's the only reason we're looking for that to be done. I might pass to my colleague Dennis Devan, who's has a bit more detail on this, might be able to expand on my point.
Yeah, no, it's when it comes down to it, you talked about county development. Oh, sorry. When it comes down to it, you talked about county development plans and the need for that kind of clarity and getting everything in front of just out to as many people and as many stakeholders as possible to get that views and to kind of flesh out and allow people to have a view on basically all the current events that are going on within this legislative development. So apart from that, I don't know what else you'd say.
Yeah, maybe as I have a minute, I might just ask Fair Seas, and maybe Sinead might like to come in on it too. You talked in your written submission a lot around the need for restoration. Maybe you could give us some examples as to what you think is lacking in the bill.
Yes, thanks, Deputy. Yeah, I feel the bill could really benefit from an increased focus on restoration. It appears in the general scheme at the moment. It allows for restoration activities to be included as MPA conservation measures, which is fantastic. But the bill, I feel, must go further and include a more targeted strategic approach to active restoration of habitats, species and ecosystems within MPAs. Often management measures for MPAs are focused on, maybe 90 or 95% of that is focused on the alleviation of pressure. So you take away a pressure and it allows nature, their species, habitats to recover on its own. Nature can take care of that, but there are those 5 to 10% of cases where we need to give nature a helping hand, and that's what I feel like needs to be drawn out more clearly in this, within the remit and the framework of what of MPAs, and that would be on the clarity on the mechanisms by which active restoration activities would be facilitated, delivered and resourced as well. And another point on that is it would need to relate to other national and international policy and strategies. So we have the National Biodiversity Action Plan, of course, but we also have very soon the forthcoming EU Nature Restoration Law. So I think it would be prudent to have a real strategic focus on that active restoration element, as well as, of course, everything else, the protection and management that is the bread and butter of MPA implementation.
Super, thank you. Just to mention, I have a committee meeting next door as well at the same time, so apologies I can't stay. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks. Take the, sorry, Senator Boyne, you're first, yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our guests here to this really important session, and thank you for your submissions. We've read them in advance and I think they're really important. given the time constraint, I'm going to keep my time pretty focused. I suppose, one, I think it's great to see that more people are coming on board in relation to the 8 weeks period of consultation. I think you've made that very, very clear. There is a momentum gathering inside and outside the Oireachtas board. I think there's been huge amount of engagement. I think there are many, many positive aspects to this legislation. We have to welcome them. I'm a former director for about 10 years of Dunleary Harbour Company, so I know a lot about the challenges of a commercial port and a commercial harbour. I'm a bit tired of this word flexibility. We have to be flexible with everybody. We can't be flexible with everyone. Some people have to be disappointed, but hopefully it'll be the people that we should be targeting collectively that may be disappointed. But, you know, to say we have to be economic and environmental and sustainable, we can't tick all the boxes. Let's be honest and let's be realistic. But I'm very impressed by this particular block of submissions and I'm very supportive of it. And so I would like to ask a few questions. And I suppose in terms of the environmental pillar network, I'm delighted you could come here. And in the issue of the Aarhus Convention, because it's very, very significant, and the issue of the open access to data, this is really, really important. This open access to data in compliance with the convention of the Aarhus Convention in terms of public participation and decision making is really important. And I'd like maybe if you could talk a little bit just briefly on that to us, and if you have short comments in terms of the heads of the bill in that, or what more you'd like to see. Secondly, I'd like if you could touch on, some of the other groups could touch on the issue of the compatibility of this proposed legislation in terms of OSPAR and our international obligations there, and our international obligations in Natura 2000, Natura 2000, and the broader network of that. They're very basic. They're two very, very significant pieces of guidance, of legislation, of acknowledgement of their importance, and we need to be, this needs all to be compatible with all of that. We can't just park aspects of it. So you might just touch on those. And finally, I just want to say, it's important that we keep the focus here on recommendations, because you'll be very familiar with the PLS reports from the Joint Oireachtas Committee. A lot of debate, a lot of discussion. But it's all distilled down to 20, 30, 40 recommendations. And I'm going to suggest to you that one of the key asks I'm asking of you is to crystallise, if not here today, but in follow-up correspondence to individuals or to this committee, to crystallise in sentences. And I don't, that sounds a bit, you know, I don't mean that to belittle the importance of it, but to be concise and to crystallise some key, effectively I'm asking you to write recommendations that you'd like to see us put into this report, because I think that's the most effective way, and the most effective way we can focus in the report, which is then cited all across the houses about the PLS report on this particular bill. And I think you'd be doing yourself a service, and I think it would help us, and I think it would be meaningful for the process if you could do so. Thank you.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much, Senator, and particularly for that last suggestion, and we certainly will respond on that. In respect of public consultation, I'm going to draw on my colleague Donal, but I would just like to particularly highlight in relation to the Ocean Environmental Policy Statement, which I know arose, and you raised particular concern on this in earlier sessions around the 4-week consultation on this, as did Professor Tasman-Crowe. We have an even more fundamental issue with the proposal in respect of this. We find it very hard to believe that this has not been seen as a requirement that is subject to strategic environmental assessment and appropriate assessment considerations. Many of you will remember when we were dealing with the Maritime Area Planning Act that there was extensive debate in Select Committee around ministerial guidelines, ministerial policy statements, the Marine Planning Policy Statement, and thankfully the Department came forward with amendments which recognised in Section 33 of that Act that they did need to be subject to SEA along with DMAPs, etc. And it would seem to be a major omission here, and that has a material implication, because you're talking about an environmental assessment, an appropriate assessment, and the application of that directive and the consultation obligations there, if memory serves, are no less than 4 weeks in the regulations. So there's a fundamental issue in relation to the one, I suppose, the application of the Aarhus Convention throughout, in terms of what are the timeframes which will allow for effective participation. And it's not consultation. Participation is a much broader concept than just consultation. It signifies, and I know Professor Crowe talked about this already, so I won't delay in relation to that. I'll pick up on the Natura 2000 point in relation to the delay. That point is really welcome. Next week we're expecting an Advocate General's opinion in relation to not just, well, more in the inadequacy even of what we have actually designated around the management frameworks for our SACs. And that is compounded then by the delay in designation. I'll turn to colleagues in relation to your questions on OSPR now and to expand further on the public consultation point. Yeah.
Just on the public participation again, and absolutely reiterate everything Oireachtas said and others regarding the 4-week consultation window, but I think it's also important to highlight that public participation is so much more than the written submissions, and I know Professor Crowe had mentioned that in his submission. You know, I think there's a need to really focus on the quality and not just the quantity of how we engage on these issues. And there can be varying levels of public participation too, from stakeholders, from being at the table throughout and inputting views, but there can also be the other further end of that, which is to propose areas, community proposed areas, bottom-up approach, which I think around the world has proven a very successful model when it comes to the implementation and compliance and the positive biodiversity outcomes that come from MPAs. There's examples of that in Spain, in northwest Spain, with a fishing cooperative suggesting community proposed MPAs essentially that have all stakeholders and communities on board. There's a similar example in the Isle of Arran in Scotland, in Lamlash Bay, which I had the pleasure of visiting a number of years ago, a community proposed area that has had really successful biodiversity outcomes ever since. And just one other point there in relation to, I think there was the very good stakeholder engagement work that Professor Crowe and the independent advisory group carried out a couple of years ago. Many of the engagement that I attended myself, but site selection for MPAs will be different. It will have a hugely local focus. You know, we're talking about the designation of bays, little areas people are completely invested in. That is different. Despite the overwhelming eagerness to engage by stakeholders in Professor Crowe's and the group's report, there will be an overwhelming interest at a really local level to engage in a different way of this that is local and not a national principled. This is about actual designation of sites. So I think that needs to be incorporated and possibly stated in the bill as well to reflect the need for national, regional, local scale engagement around the table online as diverse and open and transparent and as early as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Lynn, you have your hand up there. Sorry, I keep missing you there.
No, you're fine. It's fine. I just on the RS convention, it would be very useful if the facility was there to notify people who are interested in things like foreshore licenses that it has come up for public consultation. At the moment, we have 30-odd foreshore licenses in a status of applied, and they're not there for consultation. And then you have 28 days, for example, on a foreshore license to submit your consultation wording or whatever. So it would be very useful if you didn't have to go in and check every day or whatever it is you do, because I think a lot of people are missed from the consultation process because they're not aware that a license has come up for consultation. With regard to, maintaining a sort of biodiversity in Irish waters, I think one of the things that hasn't really been discussed yet, and perhaps I'm jumping the gun on this, but is acoustic monitoring. We need an acoustic monitoring network. We need to be able to not just monitor noise, anthropogenic noise, man-made noise in the ocean, not just impulsive noise which comes from seismic surveys, the information submitted by seismic companies, continuous noise which is shipping noise which comes from AIS. We need actual hydrophones in the water to be actually listening to what's going on, because we are not aware of the noise in our oceans, and we're not aware of the fish and of cetaceans that are present and their use of Irish waters, because we have no acoustic monitoring network. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. Mr. Fogarty, you wish to come back in on that? Yeah.
I'll just make a point, Senator, about OSPAR and the Natura 2000. OSPAR has been with us for a very long time, but it doesn't have any teeth, basically, so there's no legislative backing to what comes out of OSPAR. Natura 2000 obviously does have strong legislative backing. And I would just make the point that some of the language in the bill is taken from the Habitats Directive, is familiar to us from the Habitats Directive, and then in other areas not so much. And I would highlight one particular area around Head 11, which states that the designation of a marine protected area should not preclude appropriate development in that area. But there's no mechanism then to decide what is appropriate development. Who decides what is appropriate development? In fact, under Head 14, it says that the authority can basically give it permission, and it says under 5.2, it says if no reasonable alternative solutions exist. I mean, that's basically a carte blanche for a planning authority to give a development permission in a marine protected area, whereas at least in the Habitats Directive we have strong language and we have obviously a body of case law to decide those mechanisms. So, I mean, maybe we don't want to be doubling up on procedures and language that's already in the Habitats Directive, but maybe an opportunity to streamline would be to carry forward some of the language that we're familiar with into this bill, and so give us certainty as to how projects in MPAs are going to be assessed and who's going to assess them.
Thank you, Mr. Fogarty. I have to move on, but I am going to bring you in on my questioning, Ms. Lawson. So, thank you. I'm going to take the next slot. Thanks, Senator Boyne. And I want to welcome Minister Noonan to committee this morning. I think it indicates your commitment and interest to this, that you're here in the public gallery to listen to our experts. I've read quite a bit on marine protected areas before this legislation was produced, and when I saw this being produced, this general scheme being published on December 16th, and I read through it, I was firstly I was delighted to see it, and also want to acknowledge the committee members as well. We found the opportunity to deal with this as soon as we possibly could after the production of the general scheme, because we're obviously going into the consolidated planning bill, and that's going to take quite a lot of our time. So I think that's very positive. The process we're in at the moment, we'll produce a report with recommendations. I know many of you are familiar with this, and it's at that production of the bill stage that we can and we would have that opportunity to tighten up on that language or to clarify, because it will be a piece of legislation, whereas this is a general scheme. So just to clarify that. I think the questioning over the consultation periods, I think it's in 9.2 and 7.4, that 4 weeks and 6 weeks, I think that's widely acknowledged by everybody that's been here and all the members as well. It is slightly too short a time frame, and we should seek a longer time frame for people to engage, for people to make comments. I'm quite aware that people would have a lot of interest and sort of expertise and knowledge of the marine area. We don't want to push out that time period for so long that we actually delay these things, but I think we can find a fair balance in that. Mr. Fogarty, your question on appropriate. So would a definition of what appropriate be something that can be proven not to negatively impact on the objectives of what you're trying to protect? Would that be something in and around appropriate? I just asked you to hold on that one for a minute and come back to me. Wind Energy Ireland, you have members who have put in offshore wind farms across Europe and have experience of this. Have any of your members fed into you on their experiences of developing an offshore wind farm in a marine protected area or in proximity to a marine protected area? And I think the learning experience from that, we're late to the game in offshore, but it's not like it's been done in other places. So I'd be interested on the feedback on that. And lastly, in IEN, in your submission, I read this piece, general scheme, and I was fairly happy to see it coming forward. I thought it was positive, fully support what we're trying to do here, and I think you know that. But you say, evaluated as a basic piece of legislation in terms of what it can deliver as an outcome, it falls very short, leaving scope for delay, weak implementation, poor and inadequate protection, and falls far short of the expectations of our members focused in this area. And you explain why. So I just want to ask Birdwatch, Irish Wildlife Trust, Fair Seas and Irish Whale and Dolphin, would you share that? Is that overly critical, because to my reading of it, I thought it was actually quite a positive piece of legislation, notwithstanding that there is areas that we do need to tighten up the language in. So I think the first question, Mr. Fogarty. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Matthews. What constitutes appropriate, in one way, has already been decided. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature is the scientific authority for nature conservation in Ireland. They have already said that an MPA should not have industrial activities and infrastructure development, and as it says, it includes, and I'm quoting here, mining, industrial fishing, oil and gas extraction are not compatible with marine protected areas. It also defines what industrial fishing is by the IUCN. So a lot of that work has already been done about immediately what shouldn't be taking place within an MPA. After that, in the Habitats Directive, for instance, they use the language of appropriate assessment, but it also has a lot of detail on that. So, for instance, under Head 11, it says that the authority shall satisfy itself that the proposed activity would, on the best available scientific information, which is good, comply with the conservation objectives of the MPA. Whereas the wording in, say, the Habitats Directive is that there will not be a significant effect on the conservation objectives. And we know what that means from over 20 years of the Habitats Directive. So to comply with the conservation objectives now introduces an area of uncertainty over what that would mean.
So just to clarify then, if we could define appropriate in terms of this, or do you suggest taking the already established definition of appropriate under the IUCN?
Well, I mean, I would say definitely we have to be compliant with what the IUCN has said.
Okay.
And after that, then, tighter language on it.
Okay, thank you for that. Wind Energy Ireland, just international experience.
Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe just to pick up a little bit on that point, and then we can go to the examples. So I agree with Mr. Fogarty's point there that ultimately this needs to be really clear and really clearly defined. And we totally accept. I think that there will be areas that will be identified that are not at all suitable for offshore wind development. That's clear. I think we all agree with that. What we would say is that sort of clarity and legal certainty is crucial. So that means that it needs to be based on, a really robust framework based on data, based on scientific evidence and experience. There need to be clearly defined boundaries and clearly defined objectives within the MPA. And I think the bill looks to achieve a lot of that, but as I think we all agree here, some of the definitions and kind of some of it needs to be tightened up in terms of how that's defined. But I don't think we're in disagreement that there will be areas that come under that bracket. In terms of you're correct, Chair, that this is there is often a kind of a preconception that marine activities, including offshore wind, automatically have an adverse effect on conservation objectives, and that's something that there is evidence across Europe that would say that these can coexist, and that we see examples around Europe of wind farms being developed in tandem with marine protected areas. And one specific example, I know that my colleague Patricia there has a couple more, and I'll pass over for those, but one specific example that members might be aware of, I think at the moment the biggest wind farm in the UK, or maybe in Scotland, the Sea Green offshore wind farm, recently completed by SSE. So there was an overlap there with the Firth of Forth Banks Complex Nature Conservation MPA. So a bit of a tongue twister, but that was an MPA designated shelf banks and mounds and offshore subsidal tans and gravels supporting a species called ocean quahog aggregations. So this is a good example of how this can be done properly, and we're happy to take away and get some more detail on this from members after the meeting if that is useful. But it involved early engagement between the Joint Nature Conservation Committee in Scotland, Marine Scotland and the SSE project, Sea Green project, on potential designations and management measures supported by environmental assessments and consideration of impacts. There was then subsequently an assessment carried out of whether the offshore wind farm would be capable of affecting the protected features of the MPA. It was concluded in that case that there was no significant risk of Sea Green hindering the achievement of the conservation objectives of the MPA, provided that relevant conditions were complied with. And I think that's important, that as long as the Sea Green wind farm was able to comply with what was set out in that assessment, then it could be deemed to not having that adverse effect. And these conditions were repeated then in the grid connection application and licence and the planning consent of the wind farm to make sure that it was compliant all along the way. So I think there are examples across Europe and particularly in the North Seas where offshore wind has been developed over a long number of years and is quite a mature industry, unlike where we are now starting off our offshore journey, where we can draw best experience from there and learn from what was done well and learn from what was done badly as well. I think that's our opportunity as Ireland in starting our offshore journey now. I might pass to my colleague Patricia Comiskey, who I know has another example that is quite interesting and could give some more information to colleagues, and we're happy to follow up with more detail on these after the meeting if that's useful to members.
Thanks very much, Lyle. If you thought Firth Forth was a tongue twister, I'm actually not going to pronounce the names of the MPAs. There's a project based in Belgium, and basically a colleague of mine is on an EU project called SCORES, where they're looking at opportunities for co-location. And we were recently at a session where the opportunities for co-location were being explored throughout Europe. So in Belgium, they're actively looking at, as part of their marine spatial plan, at integrating offshore wind farms on a currently designated MPA area. And I will supply the name afterwards. I'm just not going to pronounce it. It's in Belgium. And also in the Netherlands, there's currently deployed wind farms where they're looking at now actively co-locating MPAs. So they're looking at the reverse. So they're looking at areas where you could passively fish or put in place kind of nature conservation measures to encourage an MPA or development of an MPA. So there are definitely opportunities and examples in other jurisdictions where they're actively looking at this opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Comiskey. And Ms. Loughran, I know you indicate on the last one, so I'd like to bring you in now to cover that comment, and apologies.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, so in terms of the statement made by the IEN, we absolutely would not think that it's overly critical. We would 100% agree with the statement made. There are a number of weaknesses and areas of the bill that are of serious concern to us, that the bill is not actually focused on conservation, and there are a number of areas where absolute minimum could be done and actually the conservation objectives of marine protected areas could be at risk. Some of those weaknesses that we've already touched on are in the weak language in terms of percentage coverage by 2030, up to rather than at least, in terms of the strictly protected coverage. If you're looking at marine protected areas and the ocean and all of the species within it as our greatest ally to climate change, then absolutely 10% is the absolute minimum for strictly protected areas. The nature of those features that can deliver those climate benefits absolutely need strict protection, and there's no way around that. In terms of the, I suppose, legislative priority and conservation being at the core, we spoke about appropriate development and existing licensed activities being allowed to continue perhaps after an MPA has been designated. And the wording within the legislation is very unclear as to what exactly would constitute appropriate development, but also in terms of how those existing licenses would go about. Like, if it's not in line with conservation objectives of the MPA, there should be a phasing out of those activities and a just transition approach applied where appropriate. In terms of OECMs and offshore renewable energy, we absolutely would not see offshore renewable energy being part of an MPA. In fact, Birdwatch is part of BirdLife Europe and Central Asia, and even offshore renewable energy wouldn't be a feature within OECMs. OECMs have an incredibly high standard of conservation that they have to deliver in order to be considered OECMs. And that's not reflected in the bill either. There's no definition of the kind of activities that can be allowed within an OECM. And that's a real concern because it's assumed that offshore renewable energy can fit within OECMs and therefore contribute to 30 by 30. Birdwatch wouldn't even see OECMs being part of 30 by 30. They're an additional tool that can deliver conservation benefits. And some of those, I suppose, really stringent criteria relate to OECMs. If they're going to be included, they really need to provide
very high standards in terms of ecological representation and similar and the same equivalent conservation benefits that an actual MPA would deliver. And the nature of offshore renewable energy and many OECMs is that they just simply can't do that because they're introducing new or alternative habitat. They don't benefit the entire ecosystem within that. They might benefit one or two species perhaps, but it's not an ecological representation. So that would be some of the things. In terms of the overall ambition and in relation to our existing commitments, there's a lot of gaps, I guess, in terms of habitats directives and birds directives. There's clarity needed on the IUCN lists that would be included for identification of potential marine protected areas. At the moment, we have 23 of Ireland's 24 breeding seabirds on amber or red lists, and the vast majority of those wouldn't be considered threatened under the IUCN lists. So that's of real concern to us.
Could I sorry to interrupt you. What is the biggest factor threatening those 23 of the 24 species? What's the number one factor?
It is a mixture of things, but the report completed by, under the NPWS Article 17 reporting, I think it was, in 2019, offshore renewable energy, whether it was wind, so on, was the top threat there. Second,
but sorry, in our case, of our 23 of 24, we only have one offshore array at the moment. What's in Ireland, in the Irish airspace,
yeah.
Let's say?
So that was looking at threats and pressures, so I guess it was considering, I suppose, into the future as well.
Oh, future threats. Okay,
yeah.
sorry, okay. Yeah.
But in terms of current threats, you know, we have SPAs designated, but they're not implemented in full at all, and that's a major concern. And also this bill wants to incorporate those areas into our 30% commitment or into the MPA network. And it's a real weakness then if we are not actually implementing those directives. Like the bill really needs to outline how it's going to enforce those existing obligations and make sure that we're not just putting an MPA stamp on those areas that aren't delivering on their commitments at the moment. Like we don't have management plans for all of our SPAs.
Sure, yeah,
so.
yeah. And land-based, that's an issue as well on
exactly,
our
yeah.
CCs. Okay, I'm sorry, I went well over time, but that was a point well worth making, and thank you for that. And apologies, Deputy O'Callaghan. You're going to take the next slot, please.
Thanks, Chair. Apologies, Chair. I have a meeting at 11 that I have to go to, but I hope to be back after that. I know Deputy O'Brien.
I'll facilitate you to come back in.
Yeah, I know Deputy O'Brien hopes to be back shortly as well. So, because there is a lot more that we need to get through here. So just want to. The first question is just, as far as I can tell, the bill doesn't mention anything around areas of strict protection, areas around, you know, importance of carbon-rich habitats, though Head 13 obviously talks about facilitating climate adaptation, doesn't mention acoustic monitoring network, the importance of that, doesn't mention, while there's been a lot of talk about MPA networks, including when the department came in their opening statement, the bill doesn't actually talk about a network. So am I right on that, and do those areas need to be mentioned explicitly in the bill, or is it okay that they could be provided for possibly down the road through policy in the statement, or what's the, if there's views on that firstly? Yeah.
I'll make a brief point if I can, Deputy O'Callaghan. We know from experience of, well, we've had the Habitats Directive for 30 years, we have the Birds Directive for more. We know how hard it has been to implement those, even when the wording has been clear in legislation. So if we end up with legislation where the wording is not clear, what hope are we going to have to get meaningful protection in the sea, which is what we want at the end of the day? So I think you're right on all counts. We need provisions for monitoring, enforcement, you know, the targets, the timelines. We need all those to be firmly nailed down in the bill.
And do those sorts of areas need to be explicitly mentioned in the bill? Is that important?
Well, you mentioned, for instance, carbon-rich habitats.
Yeah.
I would agree, because there's already a list of things like rare species and so on. Carbon-rich habitats are not mentioned, but there is scientific work underway in Ireland and at EU level. So I would anticipate there to be EU-wide targets for protecting carbon-rich marine habitats, and maybe even under the IPCC we'll have something to say about that. So from a future-proofing point of view, I think it should be mentioned.
I think just if I could just add in there as well, one of the concerns is the potential reliance on existing monitoring frameworks that are being done under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and importing those, and we would have huge concerns in relation to the adequacy and the quality of the monitoring that's been done under the MSFD currently. So importing and relying on that rather than actually doing something which is appropriate to the MPA, I think, because it has a different objective, it has a different requirement in respect of the MSFD. So the MPAs will have specific requirements, and that needs to be reflected. Also in relation to the objectives, we have huge issues with the adequacy of the site conservation objectives. As Sinead alluded to earlier, there are multiple reasons, but the inadequacies of the framework that we've delivered there is fundamentally because of inadequate site-specific conservation objectives, management plans, etc. And that's exactly what the Commission has taken Ireland to Court of Justice on, and what we are expecting an Advocate General's opinion on next week in relation to the inadequacies of that. So relying on those and importing those into this is there's a piece of work to be done to actually tidy that up, and I very much welcome the fact that Minister Noonan is here to hear that directly, because this is really urgent, if we're to reverse those trends in respect of, the designations which are around protecting the rock that the bird nests on, but not the foraging ground that it needs to go out to sustain itself and its young, or to actually to be able to get to that nesting site in the first instance. I had a further point, but it eludes me now. So
Deputy Colin, Mr. Lynn has a hand up, probably on the acoustic monitoring that you mentioned.
I suppose in relation to acoustic monitoring, we don't have an acoustic monitoring network. We monitor seismic surveys basically it's a desk-based operation, and we monitor shipping noise based on AIS, which is essentially desk-based as well. In 2018, we had an event in July off the coast of Mayo, which, to the best of my knowledge, resulted in the largest mass stranding event of beaked whales anywhere in the world. We had somewhere around 64, 65 from memory, or was it 56? I can't remember. Cuvier's beaked whales. A number of species ended up on the beaches in Scotland and Ireland dead. And to give the example, this could potentially, based on research, represent over 50% of the population of Cuvier's beaked whales in Ireland. This all happened potentially on one day in July. And all the indicators are it was an acoustic event by a foreign navy operating in Irish waters. We don't have any control, we don't have any monitoring ability, we have nothing in place to prevent this happening again. And if this was a marine protected area, it would just be a sorry state of affairs. We can't maintain populations if we don't monitor what's happening under the water. It is absolutely crucial that we have the ability to monitor acoustically, and we don't have that. The Marine Institute don't have a hydrophone, as far as I know, between them. The Navy don't have a hydrophone. The only hydrophones that exist in the state are in the possession of third level colleges and NGOs. And one with a company involved in wind farms.
And my question really is it important that is explicitly mentioned in the bill, or is it fine that the bill goes ahead as it is without mentioning these things? That's what I'm asking you. So I think we're all agreed on the importance of it, but does it need to be in the legislation? Because we're looking at the legislation, we're looking at our recommendations on it. So do we need to be making recommendations that this is in the legislation, or is it fine for it not to be mentioned?
Absolutely.
I think it needs to be in their baseline monitoring. Is just to mention that an acoustic monitoring is an essential part of baseline monitoring. Without baseline monitoring, we don't really know what's going on, and we're not really protecting the marine area. So yeah, I suppose the answer is yes.
Okay. Can I come in, Deputy, just very quickly, just to support what's been said on that? Like, I think that sort of robust and evidence-based data is really, really important, so we can kind of get that baseline data and have it, and then the monitoring. It largely comes back, and we say this a lot. It comes back to that sort of resourcing point that often comes up when we have these discussions, that we need enough people in the key state entities that are there and able to deliver what we need to do on this to make sure it's as accurate as possible, and that's in all of our interests sitting on this side of the room. And like what we're talking about there is, we're talking as well about Mara as it gets set up. That needs to be properly resourced. We're talking about on board Planola, National Parks and Wildlife Services. We really need to make sure that these entities are properly resourced so they can properly manage and monitor the tasks that are going to be on their desks in the coming decade as we look to, roll out more and more offshore renewable energy and help us to meet our climate targets as are set out in the Climate Action Plan, because that's ultimately what our goal is here, the parallel objectives of fighting climate change and meeting our carbon budgets and tackling the biodiversity crisis. And they do go hand in hand. I think we all agree on that. I think we support, in particular, the government's continuation of the OBSERVE programme in developing our scientific understanding of marine mammals and seabirds that occupy our marine areas. And we'd support the commissioning of further baseline surveys to inform the identification process for new MPAs. I just think that this is something that requires government funding and government resourcing to ensure we do it properly. Just a short point, but just to note our support for that.
Please.
Thank you. And just to pick up on a couple of your points there about what needs to be included in the bill. I'm really glad you mentioned the network, so the network of MPAs, so slightly different to what Patrick was on about in regards to acoustic monitoring. But the concept and design of a network of MPAs at a national level, but also contributing to other countries at an EU level of the overall MPA network across Europe, is to ensure the best possible design and placement of the protected areas and what those protected areas are protecting in terms of marine species, habitats and ecosystems, to give them the best opportunity to survive and thrive. So fortunately, in one of the schedules, the indicative designation criteria are set out in Schedule 3, and many of them mention the OSPAR recommended MPA network design principles and considerations. And in relation to effective network of MPAs, it comes back to something that Tracta mentioned earlier. Ecological coherence is particularly important, as it encompasses other important network design considerations, such as the connectivity of species and features, the replication of what we want to protect and where, representativity of what we have in Irish waters, and the viability as well. So my recommendation would be the link between the relevant indicative designation criteria and the necessity to the Minister to not only designate individual MPAs, but to do so by forming an ecologically coherent network of MPAs is critical to the successful biodiversity outcomes of individual MPAs, but also it's more that we can have more than the sum of its parts as well, in a coherent network. And just very quickly, in relation to whether we should include carbon sequestration and storage as a consideration for MPA designation, I think we should, and it is provided for under ecosystem services. That's a really important ecosystem service we have now, especially in light of the climate crisis that we're in. But there are other ecosystem services, fortunately for us, that the sea provides that will help us mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. For example, coastal protection and protection from storm surges, coastal erosion, all these things. So carbon sequestration and storage, absolutely really important, and the marine has a big role to play in that. But there are other considerations as well.
You do? Okay. I'll be back. Mr. Bryn, you want to answer to put it on the record, and I'll bring Mr. Lynn in then as well.
I'm very conscious that Deputy O'Callaghan will review the transcript, but I think it is worth just augmenting.
So we'll bring him back in, but if you want to answer now.
Just particularly in relation to, it's very important to have these elements within the legislation, but it's also, that's not sufficient. We also need to have access to justice provisions effectively to be able to hold public authorities to account when they fail to follow through on the monitoring obligations, or indeed in respect of the enforcement end of the equation. This committee will be particularly familiar with Section 160 of the Planning and Development Act, which provides for third-party enforcement rights, because, it's always been an issue, certainly in the field of planning, the issue of resources within local authorities for enforcement. But there's nothing to reflect the, clarity around how, if obviously not Minister Noonan, but some future minister, needs to be held to account for not doing something or doing something that is in breach of this Act, that there is clarity within the legislation on what can be actually done in that. And those provisions are a glaring omission in respect of the provisions of this Act, and also the equivalent of the enforcement for third-party enforcement on both private and public authorities. They're critical omissions in order to really, give strength, robustness, because if public authorities know that they will be held to account, that is an incentive to improve the quality of decision making. It is a fundamental element of our rule of law. And I know many of the deputies and senators within this committee have, a very keen understanding of that. But, monitoring and enforcement on their own, targets, all of these things, they need that backbone. And that is a very, very serious omission. One thing I would just say, just to support Patrick in respect of, and to go back on my point about relying on the monitoring within the MSFT, that particular event that Patrick alluded to that led to that population significant event, literally it was a really significant event in terms of the loss of a particular species. Over that period, to the best of my recollection, the noise indicators, on the monitoring for Ireland were everything's tickety-boo. There's no problems. We didn't know. We just did not have the data. We did not have the capacity to actually be able to understand what was happening in our water. And I was absolutely appalled when Patrick explained this to me. And that's the sort of gap where we need to be very careful that we don't rely on that MSFD framework where it is weak, and to be able to actually address that. And the allusion to this being, a naval exercise event, that's not mere speculation. That has, in the last number of months, effectively been confirmed publicly by the Navy involved in relation to its manoeuvres in the area. So we're speaking with some authority, and a basis, and I see Patrick nodding away there, in relation to these concerns. And when we're talking about whales and acoustic noise, it's not just that species, which obviously is one of the species which we are required by EU law to have the strictest protection required under EU law, which attaches not just to each individual of the species, it doesn't matter where it is, it's Martini protection anytime, any place, anywhere, but also to its breeding and its resting places, and that resting place is the surface of the sea. But the IMF, actually, experts within the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, conservatively estimated, the ecosystem services of a great whale as being worth over $2 million. And that's some time ago. And that's not just related to its carbon sequestration, but its other ecosystem services. Because basically it brings nutrients from the bottom of the sea right to the surface of the sea when it defecates, and that spawns phytoplankton bloom, and it basically keeps the seas alive. So whales are a keystone species. So there are multiple reasons why, particularly in relation to acoustic monitoring, we need to be addressing this. Not to mention the tourism value, for coastal communities associated with ecotourism. I've done it in Ireland. I've paid for it in Ireland. And I've booked, before I booked my holidays, I made sure I had booked my whale watching, when I was going to New Zealand many years ago, before I don't fly because the climate generally.
That's a fascinating example you give there of that ecosystem services benefit to humanity and to our climate that whale provides. And I think many of us don't understand that or don't know about that. And I suppose most of us look out to sea and we just see the sea, and we're not aware of the intricacy and the complexity of what goes on out there, but how it benefits us.
Yeah, and Sinead put it beautifully when she referred to, the seas are our best ally in climate change. And rushing to put ORE, yes, we absolutely, support offshore renewable energy. We've been advocating for decarbonisation of our energy systems, but we need to be careful that we, in our haste to decarbonise, that we don't damage the natural climate management potential of the seas, because the IPCC has told us it is an interdependent climate and biodiversity crisis. It is not one crisis here and one crisis there, and that we can address this one first and get to this one after.
I'm going to just bring in Mr. Lynn now, because you've been patiently waiting there with your hand up. Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, that was great. I mean, I was listening to Oireachtas and I was wholeheartedly agreeing with her, so that was fantastic. And she brought in New Zealand, which leads me to my sort of point on resourcing. New Zealand has, talking to a friend and colleague yesterday, a team of 10 people allocated to full-time to identifying new MPAs. They already have an extensive MPA network, but they have a team of 10 people allocated to, to identifying new marine protected areas. They also have a team of roughly 10 people allocated to existing and managing existing MPAs. So there's quite considerable need for people to manage and identify MPAs full-time in Ireland over the next coming, 50 years, whatever. We're going to have MPAs with us for the rest of our existence. I think going back to, I suppose, acoustic monitoring, I could go back over it again and again, but it is important to identify what is going on underwater, not just for cetaceans, for which sound is critical, but also for fish species. Many of our fish species use sound for reproduction and breeding. There are acoustic arrays on the east coast of the US which have been hugely helpful, have been put in essentially by the state, and are hugely helpful to wind farm development. Over there, wind farm development is strictly controlled, but at the same time, it is proceeding at a very rapid pace because, you know, strict controls do lead to very clear regulation, which allows wind farm companies and everybody else to know what exactly they have to do to comply. So I would encourage strict regulation.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. I want to just stick on this question. I think Deputy Callahan, sorry, are you indicating to me, Ms. Cummin? So the Deputy Callahan raised about, do we need to actually specifically talk about acoustic monitoring in the legislation? And I would assume, I'm making the assumption, you can fill me in otherwise, that where we, you know, if you designate an SAC or an SPA, it's because the species or the habitat, and therefore the monitoring and the management is related to that species or what you're trying, the objectives of what you're trying to protect there. So I'm guessing not all MPAs will require acoustic monitoring. Is that too much of an assumption? If you have a salt marsh part of a coastal, does it need acoustic monitoring? And that's where I want to just be precise in legislation, that if you say we need to put in acoustic monitoring for an MPA, are you going to end up excessively? But I totally agree that you do need it. And Mr. Lynn, you probably wish to come in on that. And as well as that, just continue the point and I'll let you come back in. So then if you have a development seeking consent that is close to an MPA, and I take on board Dr. Griffin's point about the connectivity in the network and buffer zones, etc., all that kind of stuff, it would be part of a consenting process and conditioning, acoustic monitoring, live reporting, slow starts, the curtains, you know, the buffer curtains, those things, all of those kind of bits and pieces, I presume, would be part of a condition for a consent in close proximity to an MPA. Can we just talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, in the first instance, you don't know the need for acoustic monitoring until you've actually done it. If you don't put a hydrophone out there, you don't know what sounds are being made. When it comes to fish, especially, there's a lot of ignorance, and I include myself in this, as to what sounds fish are actually making. But a lot of our fish have the facility to produce sound, and it's low frequency sound, which is where we get into trouble with ship noise, potentially wind turbine noise, seismic noise, all of that sort of noise, which is low frequency sound. Also, minke whales, which I'm particularly interested in at the moment, are commonest baleen whale. These use low frequency breeding calls. So we absolutely need to know what's going on before we develop, particularly in an MPA. Bivalves make a lot of sounds. I'm not exactly sure why. I'm not sure if crustaceans make sounds. So there's quite a variety of animals in the marine environment that are making sound. And we don't really know, to be perfectly honest, why all of these animals are making the sounds, but we associated a lot of the sounds they make with breeding calls. So if you interfere with those, then you potentially affect the breeding and reproduction of animals.
Thanks, Mr. Lynn. Loads of hands, that's good. I'll go Mr. Fogarty, Ms. Gumsky, and then Ms. Griffin, please.
Thank you, Deputy. I would just make a broader point about monitoring. And again, I'd go back to the Habitats Directive. So the Habitats Directive has a requirement to monitor the condition of listed habitats every 7 years. And we get a report on that every 7 years from the National Parks and Wildlife Service. There's no requirement in the Habitats Directive to monitor individual SACs. So we don't do it. So we don't know whether our local SAC is meeting its conservation objectives or not, because it's not in the legislation. There's no particular, it'd be nice to have it, but there's no requirement to have it. And I would go back to it's head 17, I think it says there should be an assessment report on the performance of MPAs. But again, the language is such that we don't really know what that means. And if we want monitoring for individual species or habitats, or if we want monitoring on the condition of individual MPAs, it needs to be in the legislation if it's going to happen.
So, sorry, Ms. Foot, just clarify, head 17, so if it's basically we're talking about where we were lacking in management plans for our SACs, a management plan would, I presume, include monitoring as well?
Well, it may.
Yeah. It would be sensible to do that.
It would.
Okay, so just in head 17, can you just...
So it's head 17.2 and Roman numeral 10 under that. There's a few points about monitoring, but that one is about the report on the performance of MPAs. Okay. Under 19, there's another one. It says the management authorities shall review and monitor and report on such plans to the minister, and then there's other things in it as well. But there's nowhere in it about what the frequency of reporting should be, or exactly what we should be reporting on.
Okay.
Particularly around ecology.
Yeah. And would it be fair to say then MPAs will have different characteristics and different things we're trying to protect, and that should inform the frequency or what would be involved in the management plan? You can't just have a standardised management plan, because each one of these will be unique and changing as well. Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And then I'll go to Ms. Comiskey and then back to Ms. Brune.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of the points that are being made around the need for greater data collection and understanding, kind of the need to gather baseline information as a first point to understand what's out there, but then also the need to then monitor any kind of conditions, or if there is, say, additional activities happening in an area, how that can be, the impact of that might be looked at. I suppose what we need to be careful of is that we're not too prescriptive in a bill. And so what I would suggest is that we look at, data management that is appropriate to, and management plans that are appropriate to the sites and what you're trying to protect. Certainly, from my experience of working in the marine environment for the last 20 years, we have been real laggards in how we gather how the state has funded the data collection at a national level, and the projects that we're now working on are required to gather quite a significant amount of data to support their environmental impact assessments, because there's no national data set. So I think what we need to look at is how we put in place the resources to, first of all, person the relevant bodies and authorities that are going to manage this, but also the systems and the data collection to allow for, first of all, the baseline data collection, but then the ongoing monitoring and management of that.
Thank you. I did want to come back to data collection and sharing data and standardisation of data, so we will come back to that. Ms. Ibrahim, you want to just come in?
Thank you very much, Deputy. And I really welcome the fact that we'll be going back to data, so I'll hold my fire on that particular point here. But the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, basically its definition of pollution encompasses energy, and noise is energy. So, basically, no more than, species don't respect boundaries, noise certainly doesn't. And we're designating the marine protected areas on sort of lines on a map basis, specific points and coordinates, but noise will go through that, and sonar and seismic can travel vast distances. So, particularly, where you're talking about highly mobile species that need to, potentially migrate from the other end of the planet, basically, to come up to our waters. Actually knowing their pathways and what's happening in those pathways, and how they may be deterred from enjoying the benefits of our MPA networks, are getting to them or getting from them. It's really important, I would think, that I think noise and acoustic monitoring, and I'm expressing very much a personal opinion based on my understanding, that it may have very particular significance in the context of particular MPAs designated for particular noise-sensitive species. But within the context of our obligation, our legal obligation to provide for an ecologically coherent network, we need to understand what's happening in the noise surrounding that, because noise can have incredibly damaging effects, as I alluded to earlier, in respect of seismic killing krill. So if you're looking at restoring a site and you're expecting something to happen and it's not happening, you're doing all the right things, what's going wrong? It could be noise, you know. So I think noise is a very particularly special case in terms of a wider and specific obligation around, you know, the collation of data. I'm going to Patrick's point around, you know, capturing some of the unknowns, because we really do need to take a precautionary approach. There are huge gaps, as we alluded to in our opening statement, you know, in relation to what we know about the species that we have. So if we apply a precautionary approach to the designation, the more we know, we may be actually able to, in time, say, well, actually, you know, based on what we now know, we can allow more flexibility and adapt the network, you know, to allow more uses and activities, you know, on a very controlled basis. But I think if I could just touch on the issue of noise and data collection, I think it's Head 25. I think everybody has welcomed the notion of access to data and that being really important. But my read of those particular sections is quite alarming in the sense of, and I think it would be very helpful for the committee to go back to the department on this in relation to the ability to be able to charge for high value data sets. And I think that's quite a complex and quite a controversial issue even at EU level in relation to the accessibility of environmental information and for that to be reasonably accessible. So I think that could be quite a significant issue in Head 25, and I think some questions on that to the department would be particularly helpful.
We can ask, we can get clarity on that. Yeah. And sorry, Mr. Lynn, you want to come in?
Yeah, it's just I absolutely support that. You know, marine protected areas in the first instance should be separate from wind farms, but I think there needs to be a sort of realization that particularly with cable routes from wind farms, a lot of the time they're going to probably be, I don't want to use the word forced, but are going to be forced to run through perhaps marine protected areas. I'm thinking principally of the SAC for bottlenose dolphins in the Shannon and the SAC for harbour porpoise off Dublin. And we already have a number of cable routes proposed through those SACs. And it would seem to make sense to me that the state should take control of those surveys and do one survey for all companies and sell the data. Now, I don't know what Wind Energy Ireland's point of view would be on this, but I would have thought one survey collecting all the data for all potential cables going up the Shannon and going across. Perhaps perhaps not so clear in the SAC off Dublin Bay, but certainly in the Shannon, there's potentially going to be I don't know how many cable route surveys going up the Shannon.
And are there designated cable routes at the moment? Because we would have telecom cables and power cables there. Is there designated routes? Maybe wind energy?
I don't think there's any existing cable routes that I know of. Okay. There is a website online you can check all the cable routes in everywhere, but I'm not aware of any cable routes. I am aware of companies that want to run cables up the Shannon to not exactly Money Point, but very close to Money Point.
Okay, Wind Energy Ireland, Ms. Cummins, can you just come in?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question because we are one of those companies that are looking to run cable routes up the Shannon, and it is part of our proposed approach as well as other potential cable route landing points, Patrick. So we will be issuing our scoping report for that project in particular in the coming month, and we would welcome feedback from all of the NGOs, but you and IWDG in particular on that. I would agree, our preference would be to either that we look at some form of national mechanism for a cable route in the Shannon, or we would work closely with our competitors to look at a cable corridor. So our preference is to look at that type of a scenario. We believe that it is a sensitive site, a sensitive area, obviously, as you're aware, and our preference is to mitigate any impact as much as possible. Just with respect of other cables in the Shannon area, yes, there's cables, but they cross across between the Moneypoint and Tarbert. So there certainly are cables in the Shannon already, but they are in different locations. And all of that will be taken into account as part of any assessment that we would carry out.
Thank you, Ms. Comiskey. Deputy Brim, we held off on enforcement until your return. I know it's a subject that you were covering earlier, yeah, and we're going to also cover data collection and gathering as well.
Okay.
One final question on acoustic monitoring that's more out of interest rather than trying to get in the legislation. Is acoustic monitoring, is it constant 24/7 monitoring? Is it sampling, or is it mobile or fixed?
All of the above.
Okay, that's great. Depending on the circumstances.
It depends on what you're chasing, basically. You will want some static acoustic monitoring in fixed stations for sure. You can have towed arrays. You can have floating arrays. Each tool has its own specific purpose, so it would be all of them basically. But principally for MPAs, I would say you're looking at, well, if I say static acoustic would probably be the first port of call for acoustic monitoring.
Okay, thank you.
And it would be constant 24/7. I mean, in the States, they have a system whereby they have satellite connections to acoustic buoys, so that if they get a acoustic event of particular interest, that is sent via satellite, but that becomes more expensive.
Okay, and I presume acoustic monitoring is a standard condition for any consent for wind farms. I know we haven't done any here yet, but abroad.
Yeah, it tends to be part of the monitoring programme. Obviously, it is dependent on kind of the area that you're located in and whether or not there is a particular concern. But also, it's likely to become part of the monitoring requirements, the ongoing monitoring requirements under your licence condition. Just one point, and I would agree with Patrick, acoustic monitoring is extremely important and would absolutely should form part of a kind of a state system to collect data and understand the marine environment better. But we do need to be pragmatic about it. It generates a significant amount of data returns. And we would have worked on projects, say, with the Marine Institute in the likes of the Galway Bay test site, where we looked at continuous acoustic monitoring, and it generates terabytes of data. So it's just, we do need to be pragmatic about what we are looking to develop and roll out.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Deputy Bryn, can I bring you in on the second round? And we do want to cover enforcement and data, so I don't know if you want to include that in your question.
Yeah, I have a few questions before enforcement,
sure,
so I might take a third bite if you don't mind. And apologies, folks, I had
no.
to step out. I was launching a piece of legislation, so what I missed I'll catch on the transcript. So, Oireachtas and colleagues, maybe a couple of follow-up questions for yourselves, and then a couple of follow-up questions for yourselves. Now, I want to go back to Head 14.2, and we had a significant exchange with the department just around, I suppose, what some of us still call the legacy projects, or the first series of offshore wind applications. And the maritime or the maritime area consents that are in the process of being issued. Head 14.2, the designation of the MPAs shall be without prejudice to existing rights. So I'm kind of interested to know how wide do you interpret that in terms of, does that mean MPAs could have no bearing on those existing consents, or because the department gave us the impression that there was work kind of already underway. Tasman Crowe talked about the sensitivity mapping, etc. So are you concerned about that section? Are you concerned if that section in the bill actually ends up being too vague or too broad, or give me your response to that? I do want you to come in on Head 13, the climate adaptation section of the bill, because I think it's really important that the climate-related elements of this bill, particularly in terms of protecting and restoring marine biodiversity, is as strong as possible. So your observations on that. And then I suppose I can cluster enforcement and architecture together. I mean, the architecture is two things. There's the legislative architecture, but then there's the institutional architecture of how this process and its monitoring enforcement fits in with everything else that's happening offshore. So if you have thoughts in relation to those, that'd be great. And then for yourselves, the only bit of your opening remarks that I want to query, because I have a lot of sympathy for some of the key recommendations you made, is just the issue around Head 16, the expert group, and the involvement of sectors. Now, you made a very generous case that it wouldn't just be your sector, it would be others. I'm not so sure that's the right approach, and I'd be interested to hear your rationale in the sense that I like the idea of an expert group being made up of people who are fully independent of any of the activities that is happening in the marine, and that's without prejudice to the benefits of that activity, and it's purely data-driven and science-driven. And we know, for example, in housing, we often have huge political rows over data when the people who are also involved in implementing the policy, whether on the public-private sector side, are involved in the managing and the production of the expert science underpinning it. So that was one that I kind of thought, I'm not so sure. And I think, especially if we adopt the kind of approach that Professor Crowe talked about, which is co-creation, and picking up on that argument that was made earlier about the very localised nature of the designation. Like, if there's adequate co-creation from the very start, where all of the players are not just involved in a consultation after a map line is drawn, but actually involved from the very start, as was identified in Spain and other jurisdictions, that would be, in my mind, a better way to get all of the potential actors involved and keep the science and the data free of any conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest. So I'm keen on your thoughts of that. And I also would be interested to know, just from industry point of view, because obviously one consent has been issued, other consents are coming. We all wanted, I think, this legislation and the designation process to happen in parallel. It hasn't happened. That's not the fault of anybody in this room. But what challenges do you think that's going to present for industry, particularly as the science develops? We might start to realise that actually an economic activity in X area off the East Coast might not make any sense in terms of our conservation objectives and our requirements under the various directives and national laws. So maybe attractive for yourself, and then Niall, and a bit of flexibility.
Look, we have plenty of time here because others have had to leave.
Perfect.
So, Super in, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy. That's quite a lot, and hopefully we'll be able to keep on track with all of that, but please prompt us if we're missing anything. In relation to Head 14.2, this is the designation of marine protected areas shall be without prejudice to existing rights, basically existing authorisations. From the outset, can I say, I think this is a problem for everyone, and a huge empathy and concern for industry and all sorts of actors within the marine environment who've gone to the bother of getting applications, going through that whole process, seeking investment, creating expectations within their organisations and their shareholders, etc. And one can understand their need and their desire for legal certainty. Notwithstanding that, as we said in our opening remarks, the MPA designation is unfortunately horribly late in Ireland. It's over 9 years late, and by the time we actually get around, I think everybody realistically in this room knows that by the time this legislation is enacted, given the various different consultations, etc., that are going to happen, it is going to be some time before we actually have designations on the ground. So what is the implications from sort of a legal perspective? And what do I see as being of concern in relation to the way Head 14.2 is framed? Well, basically, the EU Court of Justice is extremely clear, and has been clear from way back when the Birds Directive's designations were late, not just here in Ireland, but in across other member states, that a member state cannot benefit from the delay in its obligations. I mean, it's set there explicitly in the likes of Baz Corbière, French case, the C37498, paragraph 51. It's there in black and white from the Court of Justice. A member state cannot benefit from the delay in delivering on its obligations. So we are where we are, to use your words in one of the earlier sessions, Deputy, and it's an unfortunate reality where we have that intersection of where the science is telling us that an area should have been designated as MPA. It's potentially incompatible with something that's been given permission to. And there's a whole range of issues are going to arise with this, and this is why it is extremely frustrating for us that a more proactive approach wasn't taken to the delivery of the spatial plan and in mapping out areas which, manage the expectations, particularly of offshore renewable energy in relation to where they could go and couldn't go based on a precautionary basis, given the gaps in our information. And we argued very heavily for that at the time. But the simple fact of the matter is lots of different issues could arise depending on the various different scenarios, one of which would be state liability, where basically if a wind energy company has developed and invested, it may seek to sue the state, basically for its loss of expectation, because EU law will require us to remedy a breach of EU law. So we can't walk away and just sort of say, whoops, sorry, we missed it. There is duties very clearly articulated, and particularly so in the context of Ireland. Some of the most authoritative judgments of the court, or the most comprehensive judgment of the Court of Justice in rehearsing and clarifying these points are in relation to the likes of Derry Bryan Wind Farm in C21506 and 26118. And it makes it very, very clear, and it's not limited to those cases, I might add, that you have to remedy a breach. So it's not just a case of whoops, apocalypse. There are consequences, and that needs to be addressed. The economic operators may seek to pursue state liability. You can imagine the number of zeros that could be involved in that. And that's already an issue in respect of a whole range of other issues within the terrestrial environment where there have been problems. And basically, it is the taxpayers of this country that end up footing the bill in that. But the Court of Justice has also been clear that state liability is not just an automatic presumption for economic actors. If they have had, unless they can, demonstrate that they had a reasonable understanding that their consents were lawful, and that they had reasonable expectation that everything was in order. I don't see that as being credible to in the context of the airing of issues that there is around the inadequacies of designations in Ireland. So I think we're going to end up with a very serious mess. And that's why it's all the more important, particularly at this critical point in time, where on December 23rd we have seen the granting of maritime area consents under the Maritime Area Planning Act. And we're expecting to see, development consent applications go to An Bord Pleanála or An Bord Comisiún on Commission Pleanála, as it may be called, soon. And it is really incumbent that we actually address this, because this is a car crash. This is going to delay and create confusion and uncertainty in relation to industry's expectations of what it can do, our migration, our successful migration to decarbonisation. And we actually we need to be realistic about saying we can't just leave MPAs to paddy last. We've seen this government, move at breathtaking speed to enact legislation, at breathtaking, shocking, scary speed to enact legislation, guillotine legislation, force things through when it needs to. Why do MPAs need to be left so long? Why are they being so deprioritised? And we need to actually see that being expedited. So sorry, it's a long answer, but it's an absolutely critical point. In relation to the architecture, and I can expand.
Could you deal with H13 first, just the climate stuff, because I just don't want that to pass.
Sure, I'll turn to colleagues on that, and maybe Sinead in particular, she addressed some of that earlier. Or Donald.
I'm happy to take it.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of the climate aspects of the bill, Deputy, it definitely needs to be a lot stronger. And one of the questions that Deputy O'Callaghan raised earlier, I'm not sure if you're here, was around, do we need to call out specifically certain components such as carbon-rich habitats in the legislation? And certainly we're in a climate emergency. By all means, we need to be specifying those things that we know can deliver real climate solutions first. And it's not just the carbon-rich habitats, it's all the species within our marine environment as well that can really deliver on that. And those species obviously have an inherent right to exist and thrive within our marine environment as it is, but they can deliver real climate benefits. And if the committee is happy, we can certainly send on more information on those kind of items as well. But certainly carbon-rich habitats and all of those things that we know can deliver real climate benefits need to be called out. It just isn't even a question, really, considering the emergency that we're in.
Sure, thanks for that.
Mr. Griffin, Dr. Griffin, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Chair. Just to say that you know, it's a good head. I think it's needed, urgent area proposals to facilitate climate adaptation. But as long as the focus is on identifying the areas which are not suitable for offshore renewable energy and not identifying the areas for marine protected area designation. I think that's really key. They shouldn't be conflated, because we've discussed, and in previous sessions you've discussed, the real importance, critical to the success of MPAs, of public participation engagement. So urgent, although there are urgent powers in the head for other reasons, that public engagement shouldn't be short-circuited, even for climate reasons, in terms of fast-forwarding ORE, or even necessarily for the nature aspect of climate adaptation either. So it's just about ensuring that within this head that public participation is still involved in the MPA designation process. And then a wider point, just to pick up on what Sinead said as well, about, and I mentioned earlier to Deputy O'Callaghan, about the importance of including carbon sequestration and storage in the provisions for the criteria for which MPAs would be designated features, but also to think more widely about the benefits and the mitigation and adaptation that the seas and healthy seas delivered by MPAs provide, such as coastal protection, protection from coastal erosion, from starboard surges. And it's a wider lens we need to take. It's not just about carbon, although that's a huge part of it, of course, but it is a wider lens we need to take about the already locked in and built in impacts that we're going to see down the line in terms of sea level rise, and all that brings as well. Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Fogarty, sorry, you indicated.
Yeah, thanks very much. Deputy Mayor, I want to make a comment maybe about the monitoring and enforcement, and I picked up on, I think you made the point in both previous hearings about, you know, who do you call? I mean, that's a problem that's an existing problem in Ireland, because nobody knows who to call half the time, and it's just worse at sea. But when it comes to monitoring and enforcement, it's worth thinking about it in two different ways, because we have offshore areas where the only real activity that's going on is fishing, and it's usually big boats. It's industrial fishing that's going on in offshore areas. So if you create an MPA in one of those areas, basically there's no fishing, and it's quite easy to monitor actually, because there's already applications online to tell you where boats are and what they're doing. And so you can quite easily determine whether or not the boats are in these areas or not, or what they're doing in them, if they're just passing through or if they're actually fishing in them. That bit should be quite easy, notwithstanding that people will obviously be discommoded by it. But when you come inshore, it's obviously much more complicated, because there's multiple uses, and we are likely to have marine protected areas that will have some fishing in them, but the fishing will have to be tightly controlled and monitored. And at the moment, we don't know who's going to be in charge of that, or how that's going to happen. And particularly with regard to the bill and what we'd like to see in the bill, I don't see where responsibility is laid for basically, you know, who's in charge of the MPA, who's going to be looking after it. Like, but that's even on land at the moment for SACs, we're not sure half the time whose job it is to do what. So there is an opportunity here to clarify that for us, and in terms of monitoring as well. And sorry, can I just make one other point quickly that I meant to?
Before you do that, I just want to ask you a supplementary comment. If we look at terrestrial planning enforcement, we do know who to call. And as many of you have long experience of, knowing who to call in and of itself doesn't fix the problem. I can point to any number of long-standing egregious planning breaches in my own constituency. I'm sure Cian can as well. So in addition to knowing who to call, and I welcome your comments on that, have you anything to say then about, well, even when we do have somebody to call, how do we ensure that monitoring and enforcement takes place? Because on the terrestrial side, we've a whole other set of problems that we've learned from through bitter experience, and it would be good, I think, for everybody if we didn't repeat those mistakes, and we're having a conversation in 20 years' time about how we fix that bit of the enforcement.
Well, maybe that's a resourcing issue, because a lot of the time, let's say if we are out and about and we see damage in an SAC, let's say someone sees a digger working in an SAC and is wondering, should that be going on or not? You can call your local wildlife ranger and they might be able to tell you whether it is or not, but it may be harder for them to tell you whether they can do something about it. But then some of the parts of the country, for instance, we don't have wildlife rangers. So that's a resourcing issue. It's not necessarily a legislative one. Sorry, can I just make the other point?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a quick one, and it's just under Head 17, and it talks about how MPAs are to be identified. And it says they'll be identified using the best available scientific information, which is great, which is what we want and what we need. But then it also says that they will seek to minimise the negative economic impacts and maximise the positive economic impacts. And to me, that's it's not only contrary to deciding where these are in relation to best scientific information, but it's also inappropriate, I think, for a bill that is about the conservation of nature. There's already a provision, I think, elsewhere about overriding reasons of public interest. If there's an absolute need to do something, and in EU law under the Habitats Directive, there's a mechanism. That's not just a willy-nilly get-out clause. It's quite a serious trigger. But I think putting in something that says we have to maximise the economic impacts and minimise the costs is not appropriate.
Thanks, Mr. Fogarty. And before I go to Deputy O'Callaghan, could somebody clarify for me how much protected area we have currently? We're aiming for 30. Where are we at the moment?
8%. I believe we're just above 8%.
At 8%.
Yeah, just
so
above.
we were 2.3 up to quite recently. We're at 8 now, heading for 10. And that's designation. And I know that's not marine protected areas as such, because we don't have marine protected areas.
Chair,
Process at the moment.
With your indulgence, could Niall just have a minute or two just to respond to the questions I asked, only because he didn't get in on the first round I asked. Apologies. My problem is I asked too many questions.
If I could I just want to finish the point and then I'll bring Niall in. So, Mr. Bryn, you referred to the speed at which legislation has gone through the Oireachtas quite recently, and I know your concerns on that, but I'm quite happy that we proceed at speed with this and get it right, and I think that's to be acknowledged as well, because we all want to achieve the 30 and the 10%, and this will assist us to do it. Okay, sorry, Deputy Bryn, do you want to bring in Mr. Goodwin then, please?
That's okay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy. So I'll just quickly address the questions that Deputy O'Brien posed to ourselves, and maybe taking the first one around the expert committee and industry involvement and NGO involvement. I think it's a good question that you pose, and is it better to have kind of just purely independent scientific expert? I guess where we're coming from on this, and it isn't just industry, of course, that we would like on this expert group, we'd like the involvement of environmental NGOs. We think that the fishing community and other sea users would be useful to have on there. Why we say that, I guess, is that sort of experience both here and in other jurisdictions. In our case, from an industry perspective, I think there's a lot of expertise of kind of what has been done elsewhere, what has been done in the North Seas, for example, what is being done now in the Baltic Seas, where there are kind of good practices being put in place, lessons learned for good and for bad that we might be able to bring to the process here. And I think by having industry at the table, that would enable us to do that. Likewise, by having environmental NGOs at the table, they'd be able to bring their significant expertise on this. And also, when we often discuss about, the role of the fishers, we see the fishers as knowing the sea better than anybody. Often when we talk to developers, they see that in their engagement with the fishing community, that these are the people who know what it's like out there, they know what the conditions are like. So that sort of expertise would be extremely useful for such an expert committee. Just even to make a broader point on this, Ireland is at the very early stages of our sort of the process towards getting towards our offshore targets. We have a single offshore wind farm off the coast of Wicklow, SSE's Arklow Bank. We didn't kick on after that and develop at the pace and scale that they did in the likes of Denmark, Netherlands, and the UK. And while maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, that does give us an opportunity to learn and to bring in that sort of experience. This goes across, auction design, when we decide how we're going to support these projects. It goes across how EirGrid, for example, is going to develop, consent and then develop our offshore network. That is, they will now be tasked with doing somewhat up to 2030, but then post 2030, our TSO EirGrid will be in the lead in kind of planning out what our offshore network looks like. And I think being able to bring in expertise from overseas where that has successfully been done already can only benefit such an expert group. I would caveat that, though, Deputy O'Brien, in saying that that would, of course, need to come with the highest levels of transparency, and it would need to be very clear what role and clearly defined roles that each of these stakeholders would bring to such a group. And I think that's paramount. But it's that ability to be able to get that expertise into the room is where our suggestion comes from, I suppose.
The only thing I'd say to that is, I think your argument is weakened when you make the case for industry involvement in auction design, for example. I mean, there's plenty of experts in the field that would have a comparable, if not direct, involvement in those other jurisdictions. And again, we have seen in other areas where proximity can create more problems than it resolves. So I suppose my specific question is, if there was that co-creation element that Professor Tasman-Crowe talked about, which I think many of us in committee were quite taken by, and that means that at a very early stage, all relevant players are around the table. Why do you need industry on an expert body whose job is really to provide fully independent and impartial evidence and science, which then underpins the discussions that would have, for example, around individual designations or network designations? That's what I'm trying to understand.
I get the point, Deputy. And look, I think if we could ensure that that bottom-up process and the consultation at the earlier stage is inclusive in the sense that we're able to get the views in and it's properly considered and it's well run and we have that forum to bring forward our views, well, maybe that's sufficient. And then maybe you separate that from the independent expert group. I think that's a fair point. I think our concern is being able to make sure that we do bring that expertise to the table, I think. I might move on to your second question briefly, just around the consents, the maritime area consents that have been issued and what potential problems might they face. And I will bring in colleagues Dennis Devan and Patricia Comiskey on this point as well to develop out further. But I think taking a slight step back and looking at take the climate action plan and the cross-party agreement that we have across the political divide to deliver upon the carbon budgets and our climate targets overall out to 2030 and beyond that, out to 2050, so net zero by 2050, 80% reduction in the emissions of the 80% renewable electricity by 2030, including a 75% reduction in emissions from the sector. If we want to get to there, we will have to deliver on the government capacity targets, which are...
And nobody disputes that, and I don't think anybody in the committee disagrees with that. I suppose the specific challenge for you guys, though, is, and we have bitter experience of terrestrial planning, for example, strategic housing developments, which we were told would allow us expedite planning decisions and deliver more much-needed homes. And the concern many of us had at the time was not that we wanted to expedite planning and deliver more much-needed homes, but that if you design the process badly, you end up with considerable litigation, which delays everything, including the targets. So I suppose, given that developers rightly want certainty, and that's something I fully support, I think if the system is clear and certain for everybody, we're all better off. Are you in any way worried, or are your affiliate members in any way worried that any absence of certainty because of the lag with designation on the eastern seaboard, for example, has any potential risks for delays that would actually make it even more difficult to meet those targets, which we all want to meet?
Yeah,
I think that's the question.
Yeah, sure. I think, look, that is a concern. I think, in general, and I agree with Missy Brin's point that 2 years ago it would have been much better if this was done before, and we all agree on that. I think the maritime area consents give the opportunity and the possibility for a developer to be able to conduct all the relevant surveys needed to do all the relevant activities needed to do to make sure that the project is feasible and progress with the planning application. And included in that, which has been done even up to now after they've been given kind of licenses to do so, and now with the MAC, 2 years minimum of seabird surveys, 2 years minimum of maritime mammal and reptile surveys, and lots of other surveys need to be done. This is a very, very comprehensive and extensive process that needs to be done, which will feed into a planning application, which will then be adjudicated upon with all the relevant environmental impact assessments done. So we would consider that what is being done in the maritime area consents areas for the phase 1 projects, which we call them, they're making sure that no stones are left unturned, and every single possible mitigation and assessment is being put in place. So we feel that that's the cover there, and that the planning system will grant it if all of that has been done properly and appropriately.
Just one final supplementary question on that. That's fine, except if that was the case, then we wouldn't need marine protected areas, because that process would look after itself. So I'm not convinced by that. But would, for example, your organisation, your members fully support one of the suggestions of Professor Tasman-Crowe, for example, that there clearly needs to be a prioritisation of the speedy implementation of the designation process in an appropriate way for those areas where your members have just got maritime area consent or are seeking them to provide that certainty? Is that something you would support, encourage? And where you have scientific information and data and surveys, is that information you would be in a position to then share, for example, with an expert body for example, its publication as part of a formal planning application?
Yeah. I think that certainty is paramount. I think that the projects will need to know exactly what they're dealing with as early as possible to minimise the risk into an auction and a process that they're already carrying a significant amount of risk. So I think that legal certainty would be very much welcome. I might pass to allow my colleague Dennis Devan and Prish Kumbaski to come in if they want to maybe put a bit of detail on that, but I think in general we'd agree with that certainty is needed.
Yeah, no, I would just like, Deputy, I would just like to add that the OSPAR threatened and endangered habitats and species elements, which need to be looked at and are of course part of the MPA system and network, that is actually going to be looked at within those EIA assessments. So you'd be very confident that all the wind farms that are doing their assessments currently are working through them now, that if there is an issue there in regards to MPAs or, the fact that we don't have them yet, it will come to light. And, and Bord Pleanála will have their opportunity to, decide upon that. So I'd just like to make that point to the committee.
And I take that as read, but that's not the same as the level of protection, both to a specific marine protected area or indeed the wider marine protected area networks.
Of course,
which the MPA is designed, so that it's not the same process.
Yes, yeah, but we are where we are in the position we are, and we need to move forward within the next decade because, runaway climate change is occurring, and without moving forward right now, we need to get to our 2030 targets, and without currently using this dual process, we have to keep going.
Nobody's disputing that, and we're all agreed we want this as fast as possible. But my question is again about the prioritisation and the sharing of information, because I do think if industry was to say, in order to get that certainty, they would support an appropriate level of prioritisation and would be willing to share information and data, particularly with an expert group, which may otherwise not be shared for commercial sensitivity reasons prior to planning application, I think that would be a welcome step.
Can I take that one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Deputy. Yeah, and this is something that myself and my peers and other projects have talked quite considerably about. And I suppose our challenge at the moment is that we are collecting, as Niall mentioned, data at risk. And if the challenge is that, and that is for a particular process to inform our own EIARs, to inform our own appropriate assessments. In many cases, we are collecting data for sites much larger than the site that we're planning to develop on because there is no national data set. And I suppose the intention is that obviously that's data that we will need to share between the projects in order to inform on in combination or cumulative impacts of projects, but in the absence of any other data in the national system, it becomes the only data set there. And what you find is that if a particular species or whatever habitat is identified in that area, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only one in that area. It's just that the fact that we've looked there. So I think the intention to share data is certainly there within the industry, but it needs to be done at an appropriate time, that it doesn't in any way impact on our ability to move our own processes forward. And it also doesn't, I suppose, point to a particular sensitivity that may just be there because we identified it, not because it's a particularly sensitive area for that site, if you understand me.
And do you not think, sorry Chair, with your indulgence, do you not think that the earliest possible sharing of that data with independent scientific experts would help de-risk you, because it would help you, I suppose, navigate your way through that information?
I think it's something we should certainly look to explore, but I think the challenge really is that that data has been collected by each of the individual projects. And I suppose what we want to ensure is that it doesn't risk the process that we have collected that data for, if you understand me.
No, I get the point. Thanks, Chair.
Now, Deputy O'Callaghan, please.
Thanks, Chair. So just a few questions, just picking up on that point about Head 7, Section 5 and the list of potential marine protected area designations. And there's a number of different area, criteria that the Minister shall consider or whatever. But in these it says, some of them say that the Minister shall seek, some say consider, and some say apply. So it's consider sustainable development, it's seek to minimise negative economic impacts, costs, and seek to maximise positive economic impacts, benefits. Is there a difference in the status of these, because some of them are apply, some of them are seek, some of them are consider? Does that create a hierarchy between them, or not? Or do you have a view on that? Yeah.
Please.
Thank you, Deputy. I think that's a really insightful question, and that issue of hierarchy of considerations arises in multiple areas of the bill where everything is bunched together in terms of, have regard to, and there's a list and everything from, sometimes, you would expect the UNFCCC to be in there and it's not, but then just, economic considerations grouped with legally binding obligations, so absolutely, exactly the same issue arose in the heads of bill for the Climate Act, the recent update of that, or the amendment to the Climate Act. And one of the things that came out of that pre-legislative scrutiny was actually a very strict ordering of things that are legally binding, that the Minister has to make sure that, or the decision-making body or the expert group has to have very clear binding obligations in respect to delivering and being consistent with those, versus things that it may just wish to take into consideration. So that hierarchy is absolutely there. I have no doubt that Sinead will want to come in relation to just the the completeness of the lists here, but just even in terms of not just the mays or the shalls or seek to or whatever, there is that wider issue of that binding architecture around, that's missing throughout this bill in terms of what fundamentally needs to inform it is delivering good environmental status and an ecologically coherent representative network. And that should be guiding everything in terms of all the proposals, all of the decisions, everything, the reflections of the expert body. It is missing throughout. And that's why that architecture point in relation to the legal architecture informing the bill, setting out the relevance of this piece of legislation both to the MSFD, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the Spatial Planning Directive is absolutely key. In addition to actually other pieces of legislation like the ESPO Convention, because we need to be conscious not just in relation to our obligations to notify things that we're doing, but for us to be much more proactive in relation to activities that are happening in the marine environment that have the potential to damage our networks of MPAs. So those types of things should additionally be reflected in it. But I would also say that, in the context of your concerns there, I would also highlight, it says explicitly there in Head 7.2, the Minister may request advice from the expert body. So there's been a lot of talk about the expert body and very welcome consideration in relation to its composition and appropriate composition. Our other specialist body, our other person, our body, as referred to in Section 5.1 and 5.2, in relation to individual proposals for potential marine protected area designations. So, the Minister doesn't necessarily have to, can decide who he wants to talk to or who he doesn't. So there's a huge issue of concern around all of that and the hierarchy of things then that the expert bodies actually consider. But I would turn maybe to Sinead just maybe to elaborate on some of the other considerations.
And just before you come in, Sinead, can I just ask this question and you might respond to it as well? And so am I correct from what you're saying in general that some of the difficulties with this bill is that it's not clear, that it lists off lots of different things, but it's not clear that they have to be done, that the bill should be framed in a way that it's very, very clear that what the creating MPAs is about conservation, is about ecologically coherent network of MPAs delivering good environmental status. That should be absolutely clear and driving the bill throughout. And instead, while it's about marine protected areas, it's not clear that it's actually about that. So in a best case scenario with this bill, everything goes right, it's well resourced, we've good ministers, good, everyone who's interested in this, it may work well, but also if it may not, it may just be a piece of legislation, the designations, areas getting designated as MPAs, but it's not actually, this bill won't ensure that we're designating the right areas, that we're doing the conservation, that what we need to do, what we need to achieve with this legislation may not be done if it passes in its current format at all. Is that a fair summary?
That's a very fair summary, Deputy. And I think if we go back to Senator Boyan's point, it's like how hard it is going to be to please everybody all of the time in this, where there are conflicting interests, one has to go to, well, actually, why are we doing this in the first instance? To sort of be able to go back to that fundamental rationale and purpose behind, to be able to draw that line as to whether, okay, well, here we need to do this because of this. It may be a bit painful. We need to manage just transition. Here we can make accommodation because we feel more comfortable in the overall context. But the other critical aspect of that is, and we touched on it just after you left, is access to justice. In terms of, it's not just a clarity in relation to what's prescribed within the bill, but it's also the ability to be able to hold authorities to account for what they do or they don't do under that bill. And it's also a critical element of enforcement in relation to the equivalent of, Section 160, where private individuals can actually take action and pursue enforcement action.
So before you come in, Sinead, it seems to me, and if anyone wants to contradict this, please do, but it seems to me that the bill has the appearance of, well, we have to have MPAs, it's in the programme for government, it's in our international obligations, so here is a bill that does that, as opposed to why do we want to have MPAs, what do we want to achieve with them, and that being central to the bill. And sorry, I'd welcome your comments, Sinead.
Thank you, Deputy. And that's certainly something that is missing and that we would all agree on, is that overarching vision of what we want from this bill. Certainly the Ocean Environment Policy Statement has the potential to almost convolute what our existing obligations and commitments are by almost setting priorities under which then the bill will be implemented, or how we would actually use the bill. So I think that definitely makes things more difficult, because we've already got these list of obligations and commitments under various other agreements, and then we're making another policy statement on top of it. And in terms of Article 7 or Section 7.5, there's also the kind of caveat in there, to the extent possible, or something along those lines, that the Minister shall, to the extent possible. And there are items, obviously, as the tract has alluded to, that are absolutely necessary there, like the precautionary principle, also the ecosystem-based approach to marine protected areas should be a given, not something that may be applied. And specifically in looking at seabird species, IUCN lists and OSPAR lists are mentioned in those kinds of areas that might be, those items that would be considered for identifying potential marine protected areas. OSPAR only lists 3 of Ireland's seabirds in there, and the IUCN list, I think, has around 5 species in there. And that's then, when you put that in the context of the EU Birds Directive, that has much more on their Annex 1 list of species, and also in terms of the seabirds in Ireland that are listed either red or amber status species, there's 23 of our 24 breeding seabirds. So definitely doesn't go far enough if we were just looking at OSPAR or the IUCN threatened categories, because there are many seabirds in Ireland that are categorised as least concern or near threatened in IUCN that actually are very important seabird species in Ireland too. So just to kind of give a bit more detail on the specifics.
Yep.
I'd go back to your summary, Deputy Callanan, which I think was quite good. And I think, I appreciate that people see NGOs as, being the doom mongers all the time. But our experience is, and basically our job for many of us, is holding the government to account for implementing the promises that it has made. And so we know all the wriggle rooms and the get-out clauses and how the system moves along without actually fulfilling the promises of these kinds of things. So we have to put ourselves in a kind of an overly pessimistic position to say, well, let's say this is passed and we're 5 years down the line. How are we going to use this to hold the government and the agents of the state to account for what it says? And if we were to go basically on the wording that's in it at the moment, we wouldn't have a lot to hang on, because basically we wouldn't necessarily have to get to 30%. We could monitor, but we don't have to monitor anything in particular. There's no particular person responsible for enforcing it. So, you know, in the kind of disaster scenario, which we're kind of used to for 30 years of environmental law, we could end up passing this law and not get a lot out of it in 10 years' time.
If I could just add on that, it's not just and I think Pádraig has articulated, you know, the dilemma. We want this to work. It's in everybody's interest to work. It's going to help us. You know, it's our best ally, as Sinead said early, you know, in climate. And we want certainty for offshore renewable energy, not just because of the decarbonisation, but the potential economic benefits to the state. You know, we don't live in la-la land. We understand the economic imperatives here, the energy security imperatives, all of these different types of things that are very real realities. And you know, the challenge for people in relation to the charges for their energy, you know, all of these different types of considerations. But the fundamentals of being able to hold people to account is not just the legislative framework and backbone and providing for access to justice, but it is a lack of clarity in relation to the multiple policy architecture that is now emerging, exploding in the marine environment. Like, we were all mesmerised when we were going through the Maritime Area Planning Act, you know, with marine planning policy statements, ministerial guidelines, you know, ministerial directions. How does this relate to the OECP, to marine strategy, you know, arising under the MSFD separately? There needs to be some sort of a coherent, just even a visual graphic, so that we can actually understand this hierarchy and how these fit together, quite apart from all of the different bodies, because it's a nightmare when it comes to enforcement, as I think has been well acknowledged, but particularly where there's a terrestrial component. Who are you going to call? It's, you know, it's certainly not as clear as Ghostbusters, you know, but who do you hold to account? Do authorities even understand clearly from this legislation, or it's not even the intent of the architecture that this is trying to deliver is not clear. And I find that very concerning in a heads of bill, that we're not clear about the fundamental shape of what we're actually trying to deliver at a policy level, at, you know, a legal level, and in terms of the bodies involved in it, and how it relates not just to other marine legislation, but also to things like the aquaculture legislation. We have huge issues in aquaculture. We have effectively an unregulated environment in aquaculture at the moment. If you apply for a licence under Section 19A of the Fisheries Amendment Act of 1997, you can continue to operate until the Minister grants or doesn't grant your renewal. And that application can sit not just around for a couple of months, but years. Like, we've seen applications that literally have been effectively sitting on a minister's desk for nigh on 7, 8, 9 years. And even in the context of when Bay assessments, and I know I may be getting into a lot of detail here, but the integration of this legislation with other pieces of legislation, there are huge gaps in relation to that, and how consents work in other sectors, and how they need to be reflected in terms of the considerations that now need to be visited in terms of MPA obligations.
Chair, just have a question for Donal and then Wind Energy Ireland, if that's okay. So just, and Donal, you were talking earlier on and making the, you know, very strong case about the importance of effective participation, not just consultation. And I think that was well made by Professor Tasman-Crowe as well earlier in the week. And you were talking about how it's worked very well in other countries where there's been, you know, communities propose areas, a bottom-up approach. Is there, am I missing anything, but is there anything in this bill that indicates, you know, that we're going in that direction? Because if there is, I think I'm missing it. Or
I think there is a provision, or it is provided for in one of the heads, that community groups or other organisations or individuals can make proposals. I'm not just sure which head it is now. It's in there somewhere. But I think it's not very clear, as with a lot of the things that are even just lately mentioned, it's not very clear or strategically put. And I think this point kind of speaks to a lot of what you have raised, Deputy, as well as Deputy O'Brien, is about the lack of good, of clear MPA governance in the bill. You know, we have a head for management, enforcement, monitoring, lots of bits and pieces all over, but there's no real way of tying all those together. So, I mean, it is feasible that you could have really good monitoring, but with lack of other aspects, important aspects of MPA implementation, that doesn't account for all that much. You know, you could be monitoring decline of species very well, but you know, really we want that information then to feed back and to make adaptive change, adaptive management, and to result in better biodiversity outcomes. So I think in the bill, a kind of an overarching, you know, Attractive was speaking about architecture, but I use the word governance, MPA governance, in terms of who's responsible for what, when, where, and that's not entirely clear. And I think the bill would benefit from that, and it may, and to speak to Deputy O'Brien's point earlier about the expert group, I think there is scope and a need for that expert group, very similar to Professor Crow's group that is more confined, but I think it's not a case of either or. I think it's on both. We also need a wider stakeholder group that's everyone in the room, but then there might also be a third point to think about a governance group. So who are the actual authorities here, and people, organisations involved at a state level or whatever that are actually going to organise the who, what, when, where and why aspect of MPAs to make sure that they're effective. As I said, lots of elements are in there or mentioned, some of which we would like to see more detail in, but it's really tying those together, which I think comes back to the point that you have been making about that it needs strategic tie together, and at the minute it may fall between number of stools, like Porrick had mentioned. We may miss our mark with the legislation. That's what we want to avoid.
If I could just say that there's also a potential for torpedoes as well, because if you look at head 10. Yeah, well, I'm sorry. But like to be topical. But, you know, you can have the best will in the world, really, really good consultation, engagement, and, you know, very good advice from the expert advisory group. And, you know, and a very coherent sort of governance framework, management framework, but something like head 10 effectively allows for a behind closed doors intervention and appeal on an MPA designation with no other parties involved. It's entirely non-transparent. It's an extremely concerning provision in there that effectively, you know, certain interested parties have access with quite an extended window to actually engage and to materially, you know, set the whole thing off on a different track. You know, that I think, you know, in terms of coherence, we need to not just look at the way, the who, what, where, when and how, and I completely agree with Donal in relation to that, in terms of, you know, the bodies involved, and going back to my point on policy and legislation, but then you also need the code for what can actually derail this.
Okay, and just in terms of head 10, is it the lack of transparency, the limited number of bodies that it applies to, or is it the entire head 10? I mean, is the idea of it, do you think the idea of it is fine if it was done in a transparent way?
I think the notion of an appeal, and I wouldn't have any objection to that, absolutely not. But I think the issue is it's how public that is in terms of notification, you know, how transparent is the decision making, who actually gets formally notified of it. I think Senator Boyan was talking about the notion of prescribed bodies just generally within the legislation, and it's a fairly significant omission. But you know, I would find it quite extraordinary that, you know, you don't have reference to, like, the NPWS being involved in this and consulted on it. What role have the management authorities, in this? I think there's huge gaps in relation to that, because it effectively allows, a revised determination on the proposed designation, and there, that needs to be like what we would have in any appeal, where other people can actually make observations and, a determination made, and that be done transparently and published and in the public domain. And then again, that there should be proper recourse to the courts if that hasn't been done in accordance with the law.
Is the National Parks and Wildlife Service referenced in the bill at all? And should they have a role, or what's the... Head 9. Yeah.
But I think their relationship and how that works with the expert bodies and management authorities, I think it's been acknowledged that it is extremely unclear, not just the discretion around the management authorities, but who actually is going to be that now, and their role with the enforcement bodies. Like, obviously the Irish Naval Service is our principal seagoing agency, and in the context of our huge marine territory, where you're talking about the territorial seas and jurisdictions within that, the contiguous zone, the EEZ, and going right out to the tip of the continental shelf, the practical ability to sort of, for other bodies to be able to navigate that, and also to have the authority of an Irish Naval Service vessel classified as a warship with all the authority that has under UNCLOS, is something that really needs to be considered very, very closely.
So, and National Parks and Wildlife Service are mentioned there already in terms of the public participation in marine protected area designations, and I think my read of that is they're given 4 weeks, same as anyone else, to make a submission. But there isn't, beyond that, there doesn't seem to be any role for them at all. I mean, should there be in terms of enforcement monitoring? Should they be, should the bill be clear in terms of their role, Marine Institute, and how that interacts with the Naval Service? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that needs to be clarified, and I think there are related areas of confusion in terms of how these MPAs will invariably overlap with MPA interests and what is set out in the Maritime Area Planning Act in respect of limited jurisdiction of state authorities in areas that have been granted a maritime area consent. It's one of the areas of of particular immediate concern in the legislation, with MACs actually having been granted. The MARA basically is an authorised body. It can appoint other authorised body, but there's a very small set of authorised bodies, and effectively it would seem to us on a brief perusal of that the authority of existing agencies and bodies is limited now by virtue of the Maritime Area Planning Act in areas which have been granted a maritime area consent, and that is something that urgently needs to be resolved. Sorry.
Thanks, and Chair. I think Padraig wanted to come in and just quickly then to Wind Energy Ireland, and then I'll finish.
I mean, I think you can learn something by looking at how it's done at the moment in our Natura 2000 sites in the marine. So the National Parks and Wildlife Service is responsible for designating those sites, identifying them and designating them. They're also responsible for monitoring them. But when it comes to activities within them, and it's typically, say, fishing activities, that's the responsibility of the Department of Agriculture. And then if there are any changes to how fishing activities are done, that is decided within the Department of Agriculture, and they do the appropriate assessment on the impact that those changes are going to have. And if we want any enforcement of those, we find that the NPWS have no ability to enforce it. So, for instance, we had an instance in County Mayo not that long ago where a dredger went into a special area of conservation and destroyed the feature for which the SAC was designated. The NPWS had no power to do anything about it, and nothing happened, basically. And we've had no restoration plan, we've had no sanction for the person who did it. There was no investigation into who did it or why did it. And so you can see why the NPWS don't have the powers, either in resources or in legislation, to do anything about it. And maybe other departments don't have the incentive to do anything about it either. So that's the kind of thing that we really want to avoid in this bill.
and very particularly why you need an equivalent to what you have in the Planning Act, a Section 160, the power of enforcement by private individuals, you know, for acts, omissions and failures, a proper implementation of Article 9.3 of the Aarhus Convention, basically.
Thanks. And just, I have just one question for Wind Energy Ireland. You may want to respond to other things. Just in your opening, you were very strong about co-location, but you're also saying, look, there's some circumstances where that's not going to happen, that there will be MPAs designated where offshore wind energy development would be completely unsuitable. Can you just expand on that? What sort of areas and MPAs would? Because you told us about where it would be appropriate. Could you tell us a bit about where it wouldn't be appropriate and why?
Yeah, sure. And look, I'm happy for colleagues to come in on this point as well. Like, I think, of course, there's going to be areas that are totally unsuitable if it's a particularly sensitive marine area with particular species or different parts of the ecosystem that just need to be untouched. I think, but in terms of giving an example of what that might be, I'd nearly more say that these would need to be kind of defined based on very, very clear and detailed information and the best available science. So I think it goes back to that point again of the need to get as much data as possible and get as full an understanding of the areas as possible. And that means kind of funding the needed data collection and surveying and research into it. And that's something that I think the state can play an important role in making sure that that's done. Can I just maybe take the opportunity to agree with a lot of what was said a second ago?
And can I just ask a small follow-up on that? So that's clearly a key issue for your industry. It doesn't have the clarity on that, which creates uncertainty. So getting to a point where that's actually much more clear as to where would be the areas that it just wouldn't be compatible would be very helpful.
I think that's it. I think it's a matter of clarity and kind of being able to identify those areas as quickly as possible so that we know that this is not an area that can be developed. I think that's very important, and that can only be done by information gathering and knowing what's out there. And part of this might come from, I guess, the developer-led aspects of when they survey the areas and they pick up information. I think that governance point is really important. That was mentioned by Dr. Griffin and others. Deputy, you mentioned the point of we want this bill to be able to achieve what it set out to achieve, and that is to reach that 30% MPA designation, a European goal that we want to transpose down here. And this bill should allow us to achieve that. And that means a lot of what we said earlier, really tightening up some of that kind of the definitions, the legal provisions and what exactly it's asking for, and make sure that that's absolutely clear in getting us towards that target. And I think we'd support a lot of what's been said about enforcement and clarity of roles and that sort of effective enforcement of the MPAs once they're identified. I think that's crucial. We mentioned MPWS, and I think this is something that we tend to raise at these committee hearings quite a lot, and we consider that to be a really underfunded state entity. I know that it was allocated some additional funds in the last budget, I think, but still, in order to do what it should do and to fulfil its duties, we think it needs a lot more resources. And I think that's something that, not necessarily with this legislation, but if this committee could recommend that government would consider increasing the funding to MPWS, I think we'd all welcome that, and I think it would help with the overall implementation and enforcement of this and other environmental legislation that's so crucial that our development of renewables on and offshore goes hand in hand with. I think that's vital. I think I've answered all the questions. I don't know if colleagues want to come in with anything else.
Just one quick point, and it's a point I suppose that's been raised around, there's obviously locations where there would be opportunities to co-locate, but others where there won't be. And I suppose just to make the committee aware, if they're not already, that there is a process at the moment being undertaken by the Department of Environment and Climate on the OREDP, which is looking at a plan-led approach which will consider areas for ORE development in future, which will then look at both the opportunities for areas to develop, but then also the constraints, so areas that you would consider for development. That will feed into the DMAP process. So it's just to be aware of it if the committee's not already.
Thanks, Deputy O'Callaghan. And I'm sorry, Mr. Goodwin, did I pick up on you saying further our investment in the National Parks and Wildlife Service will be welcome. Is that what you said?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's something that we've been calling for quite a while, that National Parks and Wildlife and Bord Pleanála, along with others, I won't go through all of them, but they'd be two that we'd pick out as need to be better funded, I think, and if anything could be done, that'd be very welcome from us from an industry perspective.
And I think that is in train at the moment. You would have had that €55 million increase in investment in National Parks and Wildlife Service, and obviously the service has to build around the funding that goes to it as well, rather than just, because you're destined to fail, and even though you've got the money. But I would agree with you on Bord Pleanála, and those agencies absolutely need further investment, often neglected for many, many years, and we look at the result of that now. Okay, Deputy Breen, you want to come in on a brief point, and then what I want to do, we've a couple of minutes. I would just like to offer the opportunity to each of you just for a 2-minute wind-up for each of the organisations, if you wish to take that opportunity.
Yeah, two very brief observations which people can comment on or not in their concluding comments. We've had lots of conversations about data, Chair, and having a data-led approach. The big question, of course, is what do you do when there isn't any data? Do you apply the precautionary principle, or do you allow the absence of data not to get in the way of activity X, Y, and Z? And I think that's one of the big challenges in the legislation. My other observation is just the more I look at heads 9 and 10, the more I realise it's a very strange procedure, because head 9 gives us a public consultation on the proposed draft marine protected area for a larger range of organisations. The Minister can then either just proceed with what's recommended or amend, etc. But then you have a separate head 10, which is a consultation with a much narrower set of actors. And it seems to me that will just delay the process. It seems to be logical that you should just have one public consultation process. People can give their views on it, irrespective of what sector they come from. I just think it's something maybe in our engagement with the department to really understand why that's split in that way. I've never seen anything operating like that in our mainstream or terrestrial planning system.
I was thinking of the SAC process, where there's the consultation then with the landowner is the last part of that. Isn't that where you go to public consultation and then you come back to the interested part?
Maybe that is the analogy, but it's just to make an observation that it is quite unusual in comparison to terrestrial planning. And my worry is, there are some groups involved in one bit of it, some groups involved in another, 2 processes, 2 timelines, 2 sets of decisions. I'm not in favour of fast-tracking anything. I want to get it right and do it properly, but nor am I in favour of duplication. So I just wanted to make that observation.
And I think Mr. Bryn made the point as well that, I can't remember the phrase used, closed doors, but something like that anyway. But I think the consultation, the submissions, I think they should be publicly available, like they are on planning application, and if somebody comes in and says, I object to this, or for the reason for it is, set out your reasons so that we can all see it and determine it. It shouldn't be something that's not published. Thanks, Deputy Bryn. So I'd like to offer you the opportunity just for a bit of housekeeping then as well. We would intend to produce a report by February 21st. And I know some of you suggested sending further information into us. Now, your submissions are very, very good. We've had 2 further sessions, and we've had 2 previous sessions as well, so we will be collating all that information. If you do wish to send in further information, if you could have it to us by Wednesday the 8th, that would be helpful. And as concise as possible, because I need to, as concise and to the point as possible, because I need to consider the Secretariat and the work that's on them. And
Chair, just on that, I think just as a guiding note, rather than giving us additional arguments in support of X, Y, and Z, if they're very specific, either amendments to the general scheme or additions, I think that's what we'd really like to see. Rather than, say, a secondary submission that has lots and lots of words, it's more what needs to change.
Yeah, and our report, generally what we do with these reports is we just produce a recommendation section at the back, and we've got 15 or 20 or 40 recommendations, depending on what it is. So you'll see the format that we use. If you want to use that kind of format, it will be helpful to us. I think Senator Boyne made a similar point. And then just out of interest, the Murray report that you guys referred to, I think that'd be helpful to forward on to us, just for a bit of background interest and information. So I'll go first with Dr. Griffin. We'll follow that order then. And you just want to give us an overall view of it? Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. I've just, I think a lot of the issues that I've written in the written submission has been covered, so I just wanted to raise one final one that I think is worthy of stating now, because it may avoid conflict down the line when it comes to designating MPAs. It's about, I think the bill needs to include and clearly define the hierarchy or the varying levels of MPA management that our new MPAs will receive. And this hierarchy of different MPA management levels and strategies will be needed to achieve this ecologically coherent network of MPAs that we've talked about. And that will range from the lightly or multi-use sites that we predominantly have now at the minute with Natura 2000, but also include that suite, that 10% of strictly protected that we talked about earlier as well. So again, to avoid confusion and conflict in the future, I think the bill must provide the obligation and the framework for these different levels of MPA protection, and to have that stated within the conservation objective of the site as a mandatory aspect. So I think that would be really helpful. And as I said, if that's addressed early, you're not surprising anyone with these strict levels of protection, that if everyone's clear that that's a possibility from the start. So thanks for inviting us here today. It's been very useful for me.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair, to the committee. I think it's been a really useful session this morning. I might just finish on two points. One is that I do think the designation of 30% by 2020 is quite modest, and it should be quite easy. Actually, it's not an overwhelming challenge. It still leaves 70% of the ocean that isn't in a marine protected area, and I think we have a challenge there to sustainably do the things that we're doing in the other 70%. So the 30% should be easy. I wouldn't want to overly complicate it. And I also would pick up on something I think you said at an earlier session about Ireland being potentially a global leader. We can go from a laggard to a leader, and I think that I think we could be. I wouldn't say bearing the burden, but helping the European Union meet the global targets because of the area of marine that we have and the amazing biodiversity that we have. So I really hope we do get this bill right, and that we can become that leader and maybe address some of the concerns that we've had today. So thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Fogarty. Mr. Bryn?
I just want to echo my colleagues' thanks to the committee for their engagement, not just this morning, but in the other sessions, which were clearly very, very constructive and really very powerful, and also to the department and Professor Tasman-Crowe for his engagement in this process. I think it's hopefully facilitated a lot of airing of matters that will be of very use to the department, and particularly the Minister, who's shown such interest in this matter here this morning in bringing forward a more robust piece of legislation. I would also just like to thank my colleagues for their support this morning as well, and Wind Energy Ireland for their very constructive engagement as well. And it was great to see, commonality of interests, particularly on areas like the NPWS. It serves none of our interests, if they come to the table late. It's particularly frustrating for industry. But I would be remiss as a staff member of the IEN if I didn't flag the fact that funding and support for NGOs is also a huge issue in terms of our ability to be able to engage, the extent of difficulties that we face in even engaging in a process like this, let alone the magnitude of consultations potentially coming our way associated with the MPAs, which is just but one of the areas that many of the groups, around this table actually face. So I would like to flag that. There was one thing we didn't get to touch on, and I would just like to mention it, which is the transposition errors I alluded to in our opening address. And it particularly is particularly glaring in addition to the legal architecture omissions, but in relation to the schedules. There are activities detailed there, and there are pressures detailed there, and there's a critical word that's missing, which exists in the regulation, the EU regulation from whence those comes, which is that these are indicative. The way they're presented in the bill is that they are the totality of what needs to be considered. And we have seen this issue time and time again in terms of the way annexes are looked at. People look down through them, and if they don't see something there, they think that's it, I don't need to worry about. That is an indicative list, it is not a complete list, and that's a very material difference in relation to what we need to identify as activities and pressures. And just on the public interest element of Head 10, you referred to sort of a landowner and something that may impact his interests. We're talking about the marine environment, the public good, the state-owned asset here. Huge implications for the wider public interest. And I would also hark to Article 29.4.6 of the Constitution, which basically sets aside all elements of or all protections of our Constitution, which are a function of our EU law obligations. So, so
Thank
that's...
you. Thank you, Ms. Brennan. I just need to keep everybody concise at the end. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Ms. Loughlin, please.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline, and thank you to the committee members as well for the time today. Just to echo the comments made by my colleagues in terms of the ambition of the legislation and the robustness, we would be completely supportive of pushing for more ambitious legislation and also one that is more robust in nature as well. To pick up on one of your last points, Deputy, on the data and whether or not do we follow the precautionary principle or proceed without data, it's also about having the right data, and I think that point gets missed a lot. A lot of the data that we need to track seabirds and to really understand the life cycles and needs of seabirds in Ireland, we just don't have, and we really need to be collecting the right data in order to get that information. And I think that links back to the monitoring gap that was mentioned throughout the discussions as well, is that there's no additional monitoring requirement in this bill, and that's certainly something that needs to be included. Because as it stands, the MSFD just isn't delivering on the kind of information that we need. There are so many elements of a marine ecosystem that the status of it is just unknown, whether it's 60% of commercially exploited fish species or 41% of non-commercially exploited fish. And food webs as a whole is a category that is just unknown. So that's certainly something that we need to be seeing in the legislation as well, as additional monitoring that actually covers the entirety of a marine environment.
Thank you, Ms. Loughlin. And I go to Mr. Goodwin. Do you want to wrap up?
Sure. Thank you, Chair. And I'll be very brief. And thanks to you, Chair, firstly for the invitation to participate, and thanks to Deputy O'Brien and all other members who participated in the discussion today. As Ms. O'Brien said, I think this was a really constructive discussion, and I think it's fair to say that we probably agree on more than we disagree on this side of the table, which is always a good sign. So thanks for that. And I think I'd echo what a lot of other speakers have said already, that that overarching goal that we have is the 30% designation of MPAs by 2030. It's a target that is achievable, but this is the bill that needs to achieve it, and we need to make sure that we get it right. And I think we've given some recommendations as how we can make some different changes and tweaks that could do that, and we'll certainly come back to the request by Senator Boyan and yourself and Deputy O'Brien to provide more detailed suggestions in writing, and I think that's a good suggestion, that's welcome. I think that point on coexistence that we spoke about, we will supply the MARI report and a couple of other examples of that, just so members are familiar with it. There is experience of this in other jurisdictions when it's done properly and done correctly, and that's what we should try to replicate here. Ultimately, climate change and rising CO2 levels are the big challenge to biodiversity decline and really contributing it, and that's what we should keep as the overarching goal, and we need to deliver on our climate action plan targets, which we all agree on. There's no debate on that, so I think that's a point I'd make at the end. I completely agree on that point that was made about the funding and support of NGOs. We're a reasonably resourced industry association, and even we struggle to respond to everything that we need to respond to. So given that public support to NGOs to enable them to always be part of that discussion, I think is crucial, and I totally support that. That's probably it from me. Look, thanks to the members again, and looking forward to the next stages of the progression of this bill.
Thanks, Mr. Goodwin. And I think it was a recommendation in our Maritime Planning Act PLS report about adequate funding for NGOs, especially as we're dealing with the marine area, which is difficult by its nature to observe and get to. I'll go to Mr. Lynn now. If you want to give us a brief.
Yes, thank you very much. I suppose things that remain outstanding, most of my colleagues have covered everything. I think consultation on existing MPAs will be required. It won't just be the MPAs created, job done, we're all finished. There will need to be ongoing consultation. Also would like to emphasise if the Navy are going to be the enforcement authority for MPAs, that they are properly resourced and equipped to do so and trained in what is required of them, because although they're already familiar with environmental protection, it is something that they're not regularly required to do. It's very easy for the Defence Forces, the Air Corps and the Navy to enforce fishing no-take zones where we have strict protection MPAs, but where the protection may be a bit more varied, where fishing is allowed or permitted to some extent, then it becomes a lot more difficult and a lot, perhaps, training and equipment are required for the Navy. So they need to be resourced properly as the enforcement authority. That's about it.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. And just on enforcement, I think it was suggested, we spoke about this before, just even a graphic of the architecture of enforcement that would be simple to follow. And I'd say if we all had a go, that we'd come up with a different graphic, you know.
The graphic won't be simple to follow?
Well,
it's still be good to have the graphic.
I suppose, in generality, this is the most common type of issue or complaint, and that easy enforcement, and the more complex ones are obviously more complex. And I think that architecture as well of the plans and the policies and the guidelines and the EU directives and our national legislation governing that whole sea area is entirely complex, and that's why we appreciate so much you guys coming in to assist us with this and trying to get the legislation right. It's something that we've overlooked for far too long, is our environment and our climate and our biodiversity and the ecological damage that we've done for many, many years. So I'm delighted that we're in a position to bring in this legislation, and I thank you for helping us to get it right. Our PLS report, we hope to publish it mid-February, and we'll certainly send you all on a copy of that. Mr. Bryn, you want the last word? Will it be brief? Is it going to be brief?
My apologies, I forgot to acknowledge and thank the Secretariat for their courtesy in just all the organisation and the logistics, and particularly you for your very generous and courteous facilitation.
Thank you, you're welcome, and I've no doubt we'll be seeing you again at some stage in the coming months on other legislation that we're working on. Okay, everybody, thank you. We're adjourned now until Tuesday at 11 a.m.